I'm standing in a $15,000 Vera Wang dress I didn't choose at a wedding I paid for, watching my sister humiliate me in front of 300 people. "Go find another table, adopted girl." Victoria's voice cuts through the champagne-soaked laughter. "This one's for real family." The room erupts. My mother's sorry Patricia covers her mouth, but her shoulders shake with amusement. Kenneth, the man who calls himself my father, stares at his plate like a coward. I paid $30,000 for this moment. Emptied my savings account for the privilege of being reminded I don't belong. I should leave. I should run. But 22 years of swallowing their cruelty has taught me something: never let them see you break. So I stand. I smile. I raise my glass with a hand that doesn't shake. "Enjoy it, Victoria. It's the last thing I'll ever pay for." I turn toward the exit, vision blurring, when a voice, sharp, commanding, powerful, silences the entire ballroom. "Wait. Just a moment." I freeze. 300 guests freeze. Because the woman standing at the family table isn't just anyone. She's Dorothy Hayes, 82 years old, billionaire real estate mogul, Kenneth's mother. And she's looking at my sister like a predator who's finally cornered her prey. "I have an announcement," Dorothy says, her lawyer appearing beside her as if on cue. "About my will. What happens next will destroy them, expose them, and change my life forever. This is the story of how I went from the girl they threw away to the woman who inherited everything. My name is Rachel Hayes. Though for most of my 27 years, I answered to Rachel Turner. I'm a 5th-grade teacher in Seattle, the kind who keeps Band-Aids and granola bars in her desk because some kids need more than lessons. I've spent my entire adult life trying to earn something that should have been free: a family's love. 3 months ago, I sat at my kitchen table with my checkbook open and my hands shaking. The amount I was about to write would drain every penny I'd saved for a down payment on a house: $30,000. The number stared back at me like an accusation, but Victoria's voice played in my head like a siren song I couldn't resist. She'd come to my apartment on a Tuesday evening, which should have been my first warning. Victoria never visited unless she wanted something. But that night, she'd brought wine and wore vulnerability like a costume she'd borrowed for the occasion. "Rachel," she'd said, settling onto my second-hand couch, "I need to ask you something important, and I need you to know how hard this is for me." I'd leaned forward, hungry for any scrap of connection. That was always my weakness, hope. "The wedding is going over budget," she'd continued, her voice catching just right. "Mom and Dad have given everything they can. Kenneth maxed out his credit cards. The venue needs $30,000 more, or we'll have to downgrade to something embarrassing." She'd reached across and taken my hand, her eyes glistening with practiced tears. "You're the only one who can help. And I promise, Rachel, after this, after you help make my day perfect, things will be different between us. We'll finally be real sisters." Real sisters. Those 2 words had price tags that apparently started at $30,000. I'd written the check that night, and Victoria had hugged me for exactly 3 seconds before leaving with it clutched in her perfectly manicured hand. The next day, I'd gone shopping for her wedding gift, spending another $2,000 on a designer luggage set because I'd overheard her mention wanting it. I'd wrapped it myself, sitting on my apartment floor with expensive paper and ribbon, writing a card that said, "To my sister, may your journey together be filled with the love I've always hoped we'd share." Now standing in the Four Seasons ballroom, I understood how thoroughly I'd been played. The crystal chandeliers threw prismatic light across 300 guests who belonged here in a way I never would. An orchestra played something classical and expensive in the corner. Ice sculptures shaped like swans were melting slowly beside a champagne fountain that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Victoria had gotten her perfect wedding, and I'd gotten a table in the back corner next to the kitchen doors. I'd worn my navy blue dress, the one I saved for parent-teacher conferences, because I'd spent my clothing budget on luggage Victoria would use to honeymoon in Tuscany. From my exile, I watched my family hold court at the elevated main table. Patricia Regale in burgundy silk accepted compliments from guests with gracious nods. Kenneth laughed too loud at someone's joke, his face flushed with champagne. And Victoria, oh, Victoria was radiant in her $15,000 gown, the one I'd helped pay for, spinning across the dance floor like a princess who'd never known what it meant to be unwanted. I clapped when I was supposed to clap. I smiled when people glanced my way with curious or pitying expressions. I pretended not to notice when Patricia walked past my table without acknowledgement, or when Kenneth caught my eye and quickly looked away, as if my presence embarrassed him. The dinner service was a particular kind of torture. The main tables received filet mignon and lobster tail. My table got chicken. The waiter who brought my plate wouldn't meet my eyes, and I wondered if he'd been told about the awkward adopted sister who didn't quite fit the family aesthetic. Then came the speeches. Victoria stood microphone in hand, luminous with happiness and champagne. She thanked everyone with the practiced grace of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in mirrors since childhood. My amazing parents who gave me this dream wedding. My throat tightened. My incredible bridesmaids who've been with me through everything. I waited. Our wonderful vendors, Jean, you made me feel like a princess. Marcus, the photography is going to be stunning. The list went on. Friends, distant relatives, the florist, the band leader. Everyone but me. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I should leave quietly with whatever dignity I had left. I was actually standing preparing to slip out through the kitchen doors when Victoria's voice rang out with perfect, devastating timing. "Oh, and Rachel!" 300 heads turned. My heart, that stupid, hopeful organ, actually leaped in my chest. Maybe this was it. Maybe she'd saved me for last. Maybe Victoria's smile was razor-sharp and cold as winter. "Go find another table, adopted girl. This one's for real family." The laughter hit me like a physical blow. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth, but her shoulders shook with barely contained amusement. Kenneth stared at his plate, jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. He never did. Victoria's bridesmaids giggled behind their hands. Even the elderly couple at table 12 chuckled, thinking it was all in good fun. I stood there frozen as $30,000 of hope shattered around my feet. This was what I'd bought the privilege of being humiliated in front of everyone who'd watched me grow up as the charity case, the obligation the girl they'd taken in and never let forget it. As I turned to leave through the blur of tears, a voice cut through the laughter like a knife through silk. "Wait, just a moment." The room fell silent. The voice belonged to Dorothy Hayes, and when she stood, the entire ballroom seemed to tilt on its axis. I'd seen Kenneth's mother perhaps a dozen times in 22 years, always at a distance, always brief. Patricia had a way of cutting those visits short with excuses about prior commitments or Rachel needing to finish homework. Now, watching her rise from the family table with the deliberate grace of someone who'd spent 8 decades learning exactly how much power a single movement could hold, I understood why Patricia had kept us apart. Dorothy Hayes was 82 years old, but age had only refined her into something formidable. Her steel-gray hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and she wore a charcoal silk suit that probably cost more than my car. But it wasn't the clothes or the diamonds at her throat that commanded attention. It was her eyes, pale blue and sharp as surgical steel, that swept across the ballroom with an expression that made grown men shift in their seats. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When Dorothy Hayes spoke, people listened, or they learned to regret it. "I have something to say." Patricia recovered first, her face stretching into that practiced smile she used when trying to control situations slipping from her grasp. "Mother Hayes, this isn't the time. We're in the middle of celebrating—" Dorothy's gaze cut to her daughter-in-law, and Patricia's words died mid-sentence. I'd never seen anyone silence Patricia with just a look before. It was like watching someone flip a switch. The orchestra had stopped playing. 300 people sat frozen champagne glasses halfway to lips' forks, suspended over plates. Even the waitstaff had stilled against the walls, sensing they were about to witness something that would be gossiped about for years. Dorothy's attention turned to Victoria, who still stood at the head table with the microphone in her hand, her earlier smugness beginning to crack around the edges. "You just humiliated the girl who paid for this spectacle." Dorothy said, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom without any need for amplification. "That tells me everything I need to know about your character, Victoria. You're cruel, deliberately proudly cruel, and cruelty dressed in a $15,000 gown is still just cruelty." Victoria's face went from flushed to pale in an instant. "Grandma Dorothy, I was just joking." "No." The single word cracked like a whip. "You don't get to rewrite what we all just witnessed. You humiliated your sister publicly after she emptied her savings to give you this wedding. That wasn't a joke. That was a character assassination. And these people?" Dorothy gestured to Patricia and Kenneth. Laughed. "They taught you this cruelty. They modeled it for you every single day of your life." Patricia stood now, her composure fracturing. "You have no right to come here, and I have every right," Dorothy interrupted, her tone sharpening. "I've been watching for 22 years, documenting, waiting, hoping you'd prove me wrong." She turned her gaze to Kenneth, who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Do you remember Rachel's 8th grade graduation, Kenneth, when she won the Academic Excellence Award for the highest GPA in her class? Do you remember being there?" The silence stretched. Kenneth stared at his hands. "You weren't there," Dorothy continued. "Neither of you were. I was. I sat in the back of that auditorium and watched her walk across that stage alone, looking for faces in the crowd that never came. She was 13 years old." My breath caught. I'd forgotten Dorothy had been there. I'd been so focused on the empty seats where my family should have been that I'd never noticed the elegant older woman in the back row. "And when Rachel was 16, Dorothy went on, her voice taking on an edge that could cut glass, "when she was hospitalized with pneumonia and spent 5 days in the pediatric ward, do you know how many times you visited her, Patricia?" Patricia's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "Once," Dorothy answered her own question. "For 20 minutes. I have the hospital visitor logs. I also have the nurse's notes that say Rachel cried herself to sleep every night asking why her mother hadn't come back." I felt my face burning. I didn't remember telling anyone about those nights. I'd worked so hard to bury those memories. "And my personal favorite," Dorothy said, turning to address the entire room now, "when Rachel was accepted to NYU with a full academic scholarship. A remarkable achievement for any student. Do you know what Patricia said to her? The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could hear the faint pop of champagne bubbles bursting in abandoned glasses. She said Rachel was showing off, that she was being selfish for wanting to go so far away when Victoria needed her sister at home." Dorothy's smile was sharp and cold. Victoria was 14 at the time and had both her parents completely devoted to her. But Rachel was supposed to stay and continue being the family's emotional punching bag. Kenneth finally found his voice hoarse and desperate. "Mom, please. You're making a scene." "Good," Dorothy said simply. Someone should have made a scene 22 years ago when you brought Marcus's daughter home and then proceeded to treat her like an inconvenience instead of the precious gift she was." The statement landed like a bomb. Around me, I heard gasps, whispers starting to ripple through the crowd. Marcus's daughter. What did that mean? I didn't understand. Marcus was Kenneth's brother who died in a car accident when I was 5, but I'd never met him. Dorothy walked toward me with slow, measured steps. When she reached me, she took my hand in both of hers. Her skin was soft and papery, but her grip was firm, anchoring. "Come with me, sweetheart," she said gently. Her voice transformed from steel to velvet in an instant. "We're leaving." I couldn't speak, couldn't think. I just nodded and let her lead me toward the exit, my legs moving on autopilot. The crowd parted like water. Everyone staring, phones already coming out to capture this moment that would undoubtedly be viral by morning. At the door, Dorothy paused and looked back. Her gaze found Kenneth, who'd stood from the table, his face gray with shock or shame or both. "You had one job, Kenneth," Dorothy said, and her voice carried the weight of 22 years of disappointment. "To honor your brother's memory by protecting his daughter. You failed." the words hung in the air like an executioner's blade, and I saw Kenneth actually stagger, gripping the back of his chair for support. Patricia lurched forward, her careful composure completely shattered now. His daughter. What are you talking about, Rachel? She's just some orphan from the accident. But Dorothy just smiled, cold and satisfied, and guided me through the door. Behind us, I heard chaos, erupting voices rising in confusion and speculation, Victoria's voice climbing toward hysteria. But it all faded as Dorothy led me through the hotel corridor to where a sleek black limousine waited at the curb, its driver already holding the door open. We slid into the leather interior, and as the car pulled away from the Four Seasons, I watched the hotel lights fade into the Seattle night, my mind spinning with questions I didn't know how to ask. Dorothy squeezed my hand, and when I turned to her, her expression had softened into something almost tender. "That wasn't just anger, sweetheart," she said quietly. "That was a declaration of war, and we're going to win." In the limousine's leather silence, Dorothy's words about Marcus being my father unlocked a door in my memory I'd spent 22 years keeping sealed. The images came flooding back with the sharp clarity of a wound reopening. I was 5 years old, and the hospital room smelled like antiseptic and something else, something metallic that I would later understand was fear. My head hurt where they'd bandaged it, and I kept asking for my daddy because he always made everything better. He'd pick me up and spin me around until I laughed so hard my stomach hurt, and he'd read me stories in funny voices, and he'd promised we'd go to the zoo that weekend to see the new baby elephant. A nurse with kind eyes and tired smile had knelt beside my bed, taking my small hand in hers. "Sweetie," she'd said, her voice breaking just a little, "your mommy and daddy were hurt very badly in the accident. They went to heaven to be with the angels." I hadn't understood. Not really. I'd asked when they were coming back, and the nurse had started crying, which scared me more than anything else that terrible day. Then Kenneth and Patricia had arrived. I'd never seen them before. Kenneth was tall and tried to smile, but his eyes were red and puffy. He'd knelt down beside my hospital bed, and I'd shrunk back against the pillows, clutching the stuffed rabbit my daddy had won for me at the fair. "Hi, Rachel," he'd said softly. "I'm your Uncle Kenneth. Your daddy was my brother. I loved him very much." His voice had caught. "You're going to come live with us now. With me and Aunt Patricia and your cousin Victoria. You're going to be safe, I promise." Patricia had stood behind him, arms crossed over her chest, and I remember thinking she looked like the evil stepmother from the Cinderella book my mommy used to read me. She hadn't smiled. She just looked at me the way you'd look at a stray dog someone expected you to take home, calculating the inconvenience. The social worker, a woman with short gray hair and a clipboard, had explained something about next of kin and custody and legal guardianship. Kenneth had signed papers. Patricia had asked questions about insurance and death benefits in a voice too loud for the quiet hospital room. When they'd taken me to their house 3 days later, I'd brought only one thing from my old life, my rabbit Mr. Hoppy, with his worn blue velvet ears and the smile stitched in pink thread. My daddy had given him to me. He was all I had left. Patricia had thrown him away 2 weeks later, pulling him from my arms while I screamed and cried. "You're 7 years old, Rachel. Much too old for stuffed toys. You need to grow up now." She'd dropped Mr. Hoppy in the kitchen trash, and when I'd tried to dig him out later that night, the garbage had already been taken to the curb. That was my first lesson. Everything I loved could be taken away. The second lesson came when I was 7 in Mrs. Patterson's second-grade class. We'd been learning about families, and Mrs. Patterson had asked us to draw pictures of our families to hang in the hallway. I'd worked so carefully using every crayon in the box. I'd drawn my mommy with her long brown hair and pretty smile. My daddy, tall and strong, beside her, wearing his favorite blue shirt. And me in the middle, holding both their hands, all of us smiling under a bright yellow sun. I'd been so proud of it. For the first time since the accident, I'd let myself remember them clearly, let myself draw the happiness we'd had. I'd thought maybe if I showed Kenneth and Patricia, they'd understand. They'd let me talk about my real parents. They'd see that remembering didn't mean I was ungrateful. I'd run into the house after school, my drawing clutched in both hands. Patricia had been in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. "Look what I made," I'd announced, holding it up. She'd glanced over and her face had transformed. The knife had clattered to the cutting board. She'd snatched the drawing from my hands so fast it had torn at the corner. "What is this?" Her voice had been ice. "It's my family," I'd said, confused by her reaction. "It's Mommy and Daddy, from before. Mrs. Patterson said to draw our families and I wanted to show you because The sound of tearing paper had cut off my words. Patricia had ripped my drawing in half, then in quarters, then kept tearing until it was confetti on the kitchen floor. "Those people are gone, Rachel." Each word had been sharp enough to draw blood. "We're your family now. Kenneth and Victoria and me. If you keep talking about them, if you keep living in the past, we'll think you don't want to be here." She'd leaned down, getting right in my face. "Do you want to be here, Rachel? Or should we call social services and have them find somewhere else for you to go?" Terror had closed my throat. I'd heard the girls at school talking about foster care, about group homes where nobody wanted you and you got moved around like luggage. "I want to stay," I'd whispered. "Then you never speak of them again." Patricia had set her fingers, digging into my shoulders. "Your last name is Turner now. You belong to us. Your old life is dead and buried with them. Do you understand?" I'd nodded, tears streaming down my face, and swept up the pieces of my parents while Patricia went back to making dinner as if nothing had happened. That night I'd hidden the fragments under my mattress, but by morning they were gone. Patricia must have searched my room while I slept. After that, I'd learned to bury the memories deep, to pretend I'd never had another family, to accept that love was something I had to earn through perfect behavior, perfect grades, perfect gratitude. But perfect was never enough. Christmas mornings were lessons in inequality. Victoria would tear through mountains of presents, new clothes and electronics and jewelry piling up around her like she was a princess in a fairy tale. I'd get 2 boxes, maybe 3 if I'd been especially good. Socks, a practical winter coat, once a calculator for school. "You should be grateful we took you in," Patricia would say, watching me fold tissue paper while Victoria squealed over her new laptop. "Not everyone gets a second chance, Rachel. Some orphans end up with nothing." Victoria got her room redecorated every year, new themes following her changing interests. Horses one year, then Paris, then modern minimalist, when she decided she was too sophisticated for childish things. My room stayed the same for 13 years, white walls and a plain blue bedspread sparse as a hotel room. When Victoria turned 16, Kenneth bought her a red Volkswagen Beetle with a bow on top. I rode the bus in the rain, walked when I missed it, and later worked part-time at the library to save for a used bicycle. I did all the chores: dishes, laundry, vacuuming, yard work. Victoria would sprawl on the couch watching television, and if I asked her to help, Patricia would appear like a summoned demon. "Victoria has homework. You know how important her education is. Stop being lazy, Rachel." Kenneth would sometimes catch my eye during these moments, and I'd see something flicker across his face, discomfort maybe, or shame. But he never said a word, never defended me, never stood up to his wife. He was a coward dressed in a father's clothing, and I learned not to expect anything from him except disappointment. So I became perfect. Straight A's, never a complaint, always grateful, always smiling. Thank you for letting me live here. Thank you for feeding me. Thank you for tolerating my existence. But it was never enough. I could never be enough, because they'd decided from the beginning that I wasn't worth loving. I learned early that love wasn't something I could earn. It was something they decided I didn't deserve. And I believed them, lived that lie for 22 years until Grandma Dorothy showed me I'd been lied to all along. The pattern had been set so early that by the time I was an adult, I didn't even question it anymore. Love had a price tag, and I was always willing to pay it no matter how much it cost me. 3 months before the wedding, Victoria had shown up at my apartment on a Thursday evening. I lived in a modest 1-bedroom in Capitol Hill, The kind of place where the heating was unpredictable and you could hear your neighbors' conversations through the walls. I'd been grading spelling tests at my kitchen table when she'd knocked, and my first reaction had been alarm. Victoria never visited. In the 5 years since I'd moved out, she'd been to my apartment exactly twice, both times to borrow things she'd never returned. But that night she'd arrived with a bottle of wine and a smile that seemed almost genuine. She'd hugged me at the door, something she hadn't done since we were children, and I'd felt that old familiar hope kindle in my chest like a match struck in darkness. "Rachel," she'd said, settling onto my second-hand couch with an elegance that made my thrift store furniture look even shabbier. "I need to talk to you about something important. Sister to sister, sister to sister." Those words had been a key turning in a lock I'd been trying to open my entire life. She'd explained that the wedding was going over budget. They'd found the perfect venue, the Four Seasons Ballroom, but it required a $30,000 upgrade from their original booking. "Mom and Dad have given everything they could," she'd said, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "They took out a second mortgage to help. Kenneth maxed out his credit cards for my dress and the photographer. But we're still short, and if we don't pay by next week, we'll lose the venue entirely." She'd reached across my battered coffee table and taken my hand, her eyes glistening with what I'd wanted so desperately to believe were real tears. "You're the only one who can help, Rachel. I know we haven't always been close. I know I haven't been the best sister. But this is my one special day, the day I've been dreaming about since I was a little girl. And after this, after you help make it perfect, things are going to be different between us. I promise. We'll finally be real sisters." Real sisters. The words had wrapped around my heart like a vine squeezing until I could barely breathe. This was it, I'd thought. This was finally my chance to prove I belonged, to show that I was worth keeping, to buy my way into the family I'd been begging to join for 22 years. My savings account had $32,000 in it. I'd been putting away money since I'd started teaching, living frugally, skipping vacations, buying my clothes at consignment shops. It was supposed to be for a down payment on a house, for a future where I'd finally have something that was truly mine. But what good was a house if I was alone in it? What good was anything if I didn't have a family? I'd written the check that night, my hand shaking as I formed the numbers. Victoria had hugged me for exactly 3 seconds, grabbed the check, and immediately launched into excited chatter about floral arrangements and seating charts, and whether the champagne fountain was too much or just right. She'd never asked how I was, never asked about my students or my life, or whether giving away my entire savings might be difficult for me. She'd simply taken what she wanted and left the check already folded in her designer purse. As I'd watched her drive away in the BMW Kenneth had bought her for college graduation, I'd thought about my 16th birthday. The memory had come unbidden, sharp and cruel as a slap. I'd woken up that morning with hope fluttering in my chest like a caged bird. 16 was important. 16 meant sweet 16 parties and special celebrations. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe Patricia had been planning something in secret. I'd come downstairs to find her at the stove making pancakes, Victoria's favorite, the ones with chocolate chips and whipped cream. It wasn't Victoria's birthday. It was just Tuesday. But Patricia was humming while she cooked, and the kitchen smelled like warmth and sugar, and something that might have been love if you squinted hard enough. "Special day today," I'd said, carefully pouring myself orange juice. Patricia hadn't even looked up. "Is it?" The hope had deflated so quickly I'd felt it like a physical pain in my chest. But I'd tried again at dinner after a day at school where my friends had wished me happy birthday, where my favorite teacher had given me a cupcake with a candle. Surely my family would acknowledge it at dinner. "It's my birthday," I'd announced as we sat down to meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Patricia had paused fork halfway to her mouth and looked at me with something like irritation. "We don't celebrate your birthday, Rachel." Her voice had been matter-of-fact, as if she were explaining basic arithmetic to a slow student. "It's not like we were there when you were born. We didn't choose that day. We didn't create you. Victoria's birthday matters because she's ours. We made her." We were there from the beginning. You were just inherited." Kenneth had stared at his plate jaw, working like he was chewing words he'd never spit out. Victoria had smirked behind her napkin, her eyes dancing with barely suppressed laughter. I'd excused myself and gone to my room where I'd cried into my pillow while downstairs I could hear them laughing about something on television. My absence unnoticed, my pain irrelevant. That memory had haunted me as I'd spent another $2,000 on Victoria's wedding gift, a designer luggage set I'd seen her admiring online. I'd wrapped it myself, sitting on my apartment floor with expensive paper and satin ribbon, writing a card that said, "To my sister, may your journey together be filled with love. Thank you for letting me be part of your special day." At the engagement party 2 weeks before the wedding, Victoria had opened gifts while surrounded by her giggling bridesmaids and adoring friends. When she'd gotten to mine, she'd read the card aloud in a voice dripping with mockery. "Thank you for letting me be part of your special day." She'd looked up, catching my eye across the room. "Letting you be part of it, Rachel. You paid to be part of it. Literally." The room had erupted in laughter. Patricia, standing near the gift table with a glass of champagne, had added helpfully, "Next time, just give cash, dear. We can use it better than you can pick gifts." I'd smiled through it, my face aching from the effort, telling myself it didn't matter. Just make it to the wedding. After the wedding, everything would be different. Victoria had promised. After I'd proven my love with $30,000 and a $2,000 gift, and all the years of trying to be good enough, surely then I'd finally belong. But standing in that Four Seasons ballroom listening to Victoria tell me to find another table, I'd understood with brutal clarity that no amount of money would ever be enough. No sacrifice would ever earn me the love I'd been chasing. Because you can't buy something from people who've decided you're not worth selling to. I spent $32,000 trying to buy a family. I didn't know yet that I'd already had one and they'd stolen it from me. The Four Seasons ballroom was everything Victoria had dreamed of, and I'd arrived early enough to watch the final preparations transform the space into something out of a magazine spread. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across white linen tablecloths. Centerpieces of white roses and orchids bloomed from silver vases so tall they seemed to touch the ceiling. The polished marble floor reflected the soft glow of hundreds of candles arranged on every surface. It was breathtaking. It was also $30,000 of my future scattered across a single room for a single night. I approached the seating chart displayed on an easel near the entrance, a beautiful calligraphed arrangement showing each table and its assigned guests. My eyes scanned the names looking for my own. Table 1 held Kenneth, Patricia, Victoria, and her new husband. Table 2 was for the bridesmaids and groomsmen. Table 3 for Patricia's parents and siblings. I kept reading. Table 4, 5, 6. Aunts, uncles, cousins, friends. My name should be near the family tables, surely. We were sisters after all. Victoria had said so. But I reached table 12 and still hadn't found myself. A cold feeling started in my stomach and spread outward like ice water through my veins. "Excuse me," I said to a coordinator passing by with a clipboard and a headset. "I don't see my name on the seating chart." She stopped, consulted her list, her perfectly plucked eyebrows drawing together. "What's your name?" "Rachel Hayes. I'm the bride's sister." Her frown deepened. She brought her radio to her lips. "Hey, do we have a Rachel Hayes on the guest list?" "She says she's family, but I'm not seeing her on the chart." Static, then a voice crackling back. "Who?" The coordinator looked at me with barely concealed impatience, already late for whatever crisis was unfolding in the kitchen. "The bride's sister." A long pause. Then, "Oh, yeah, the adopted one. They said just have her find a seat somewhere. Didn't specify where." The coordinator's expression shifted into something between pity and discomfort. She gestured vaguely toward the back of the ballroom. "Just find an open seat. Table 11 has some space." Table 11 was in the far back corner, tucked beside the swinging kitchen doors, where waitstaff would be rushing in and out all night. It was the table they'd use for overflow for +1s who RSVP'd late for people who weren't quite important enough to plan for. I walked toward it on legs that felt disconnected from my body, my navy blue dress suddenly feeling even more inadequate against the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits surrounding me. The other people at table 11 were strangers. An elderly couple who introduced themselves as friends of Victoria's husband's great-aunt. A middle-aged man who worked with Kenneth, but seemed surprised to have been invited at all. A young woman who was someone's plus one and kept checking her phone. None of them knew the family. None of them knew me. We were the cast-offs, the afterthoughts seated where we wouldn't interfere with the real celebration happening at the front of the room. I sat down and tried to make myself small, which had always been my greatest talent. The reception began, and I watched it unfold like I was viewing it through glass. The ice sculptures Victoria had agonized over caught the light and slowly began their inevitable melt swans transforming into abstract shapes. Waiters circulated with trays of caviar and champagne that cost more per glass than I spent on groceries in a week. A live band played from a raised stage, their music filling the space with a sophistication that a DJ could never match. Every detail was perfect, because every detail had been paid for much of it with money I would never get back. I watched Kenneth lead Victoria onto the dance floor for their father-daughter dance, watched her rest her head on his shoulder, while he beamed with pride at this daughter he'd raised, this daughter who was really his. Patricia stood at the edge of the dance floor, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, the picture of maternal joy. Photographers circled them like satellites, capturing every angle of this picture-perfect family moment. Nobody called me over for photos. Nobody even looked in my direction. When dinner was served, the waiter placed a plate in front of me that was different from what I could see being served at the main tables. Where they received filet mignon and butter-poached lobster tail, I got chicken breast with a cream sauce that had already begun to congeal. The waiter wouldn't meet my eyes as he set it down, and I wondered if he'd been specifically instructed about the girl at table 11, the one who didn't quite belong. I ate in silence while my table mates made polite small talk about people they barely knew. Between the salad course and the entree, I saw Patricia lean toward a cluster of guests at a nearby table. Her hand raised to her mouth in that gesture that always preceded gossip. She gestured subtly in my direction, and I watched as 4 sets of eyes turned to look at me. They weren't even subtle about it. Patricia was speaking, her lips moving with practiced sympathy, and I could imagine the narrative she was spinning. Poor thing, we took her in when she had nothing. So generous of us to give her a home, such a tragedy about her real parents. We've done our best with her. The lies floated across the room like poison infecting every conversation. I caught fragments from other tables as the night wore on. The adopted daughter. So sad. They're saints for taking her in. Each whisper was another layer of fiction built on top of the truth, burying it so deep that nobody would ever think to dig. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly understand, was that I was the reason they were all here. Every forkful of filet mignon, every sip of premium champagne, every note from the live band, every rose in every centerpiece existed because I had made it possible. I hadn't just attended this wedding. I had built it brick by expensive brick with money I'd saved by eating ramen and wearing secondhand clothes and living in an apartment where the heat barely worked. They were celebrating with my sacrifice while telling each other stories about their charity. Across the vast expanse of the ballroom at the elevated family table that might as well have been on another planet, I noticed Grandma Dorothy. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, but she wasn't smiling. While everyone around her laughed and toasted and celebrated, Dorothy's face was still as stone. She was watching everything with those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Our gazes met for just a moment, and something passed between us that I didn't have words for yet. She gave me the smallest nod, barely perceptible, and then her attention shifted to Patricia, to Kenneth, to Victoria, holding court in her $15,000 gown. Dorothy's expression never changed, but I saw her reach into her small black clutch and pull out what looked like a leather notebook. She wrote something down her pen, moving with deliberate precision, then tucked it away. I didn't understand it then. I couldn't have known that Dorothy had been documenting everything for years, building a case as carefully as a prosecutor preparing for trial. I couldn't have known that she'd come to this wedding with a specific purpose, that she'd been giving them one final opportunity to show even a shred of decency, to acknowledge me as something more than an obligation, to treat me like I mattered. I couldn't have known that she'd just written her final piece of evidence, the conclusion to a story she'd been recording for 22 years. Tonight they showed their true nature publicly, the final evidence I needed. I sat alone at a wedding I'd paid for, invisible to the family I'd bought it for, not knowing that someone was finally seeing me and preparing to change everything. The dessert course had just been cleared when Victoria rose from her chair, champagne glass in one hand and microphone in the other. She was radiant with alcohol and attention, her cheeks flushed pink, her eyes bright with the kind of happiness that comes from being the center of 300 people's admiration. The room quieted as she tapped her glass with a fork, the crystal chime cutting through the ambient chatter. "I just want to take a moment," she began, her voice amplified and confident, "to thank everyone who made this day so incredibly special." I felt my hands tighten around my napkin in my lap. This was it. Surely now, in front of everyone, she would acknowledge what I'd done. Surely she'd thank me. "First, my amazing parents," Victoria gushed, raising her glass toward Patricia and Kenneth, who beamed like she'd just announced they'd won the lottery. "Mom, Dad, you gave me this dream wedding. You sacrificed so much to make today perfect, and I'll never be able to repay you for the love you've shown me my entire life." My throat constricted. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, accepting the applause that rippled through the room. Kenneth stood and bowed slightly, his face red with pride and champagne. Neither of them had contributed a single dollar to this wedding beyond their presence. Victoria continued working her way through an elaborate list of acknowledgments. "My gorgeous bridesmaids who've stood by me through thick and thin. Sarah, Jen, Melissa, you're not just my friends, you're my sisters." She blew them a kiss. They squealed and blew kisses back. "And Marcus, my wonderful husband, who had the good taste to fall in love with me." Laughter from the crowd. "Our incredible photographer, David, who's going to make us look like movie stars. Jean, our florist, you made this room look like something out of a fairy tale. The amazing team at the Four Seasons who executed every detail flawlessly." Each name was another small cut. The photographer I'd helped pay for, the florist whose invoice I'd seen, the Four Seasons venue that had required $30,000 I would never get back. She thanked the band, the cake designer, the calligrapher who'd done the invitations. She thanked people I'd never heard of, distant relatives who'd done nothing but show up and eat expensive food. I sat frozen at table 11, my tablemates politely applauding along with everyone else, probably wondering why I looked like I was about to be sick. Then, Victoria paused. She scanned the room, her eyes sweeping across the tables, and for one horrible, hopeful moment, I thought she was looking for me. Our eyes met across the expanse of marble and candlelight. "Oh!" she exclaimed, as if she'd just remembered something important. "I almost forgot someone." My heart lurched in my chest. This was it. After everything, she was going to acknowledge me. She was going to thank me in front of all these people, and maybe finally it would all be worth it. "Rachel." Victoria said my name, sounding strange in her champagne-sweetened voice. "My adopted sister, who's been so generous." There was something in her tone that made my skin prickle with warning, but I stood anyway, my legs shaky, trying to smile, trying to be gracious. Victoria's expression shifted, her smile turning sharp at the edges. She let a bead of silence hang in the air, building toward something I couldn't yet see coming. "But honestly," her voice dripped with mock sincerity, "go find another table, adopted girl. This one's for real family." The room erupted in laughter. It started with Victoria's bridesmaids, then spread like wildfire through the crowd. People thought it was a joke, part of some rehearsed sister banter they didn't understand. But I understood. I understood perfectly. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth, her shoulders shaking, though whether with laughter or the performance of trying to contain it, I couldn't tell. Kenneth's face had gone red, but he was chuckling too, looking around at the other guests, as if to say, "Kids, what can you do?" Victoria's husband was grinning, shaking his head at his bride's supposed wit. I stood there in front of 300 people, $32,000 poorer, and felt something inside me finally break clean in half. But the night before in my hotel room, something else had happened that I hadn't fully understood yet. I'd been sitting on the edge of the bed in my modest room at a Holiday Inn 2 miles from the Four Seasons, seriously considering not going to the wedding at all. I'd already paid for it. The money was gone. What did I owe them beyond that? Why should I subject myself to another day of being invisible, of watching them celebrate with resources I'd provided, while pretending I didn't exist? The knock on my door had been soft, but firm. When I'd opened it, Dorothy Hayes stood in the hallway, elegant in a charcoal traveling suit, carrying a small wrapped box tied with white ribbon. "Grandma Dorothy?" I'd said, shocked. We'd barely spoken over the years. Patricia had always found ways to cut our interactions short to keep us separated with excuses and scheduling conflicts and suddenly remembered obligations. "May I come in, Rachel?" Her voice had been gentle, and I'd stepped aside automatically. She'd settled into the room's single armchair and placed the box on the desk. "I wanted to give you this before tomorrow. Open it." My hands had trembled as I'd unwrapped it. Inside was a leather-bound photo album, worn at the edges but carefully maintained. I'd opened it to the first page and stopped breathing. There I was at 5 years old, first day of kindergarten, standing in front of Kenneth and Patricia's house with a backpack almost as big as I was. I was trying to smile, but my eyes were red from crying. I didn't remember anyone taking this photo. I'd turned the page. Age 8, at my elementary school science fair, holding a first-place ribbon and a poster board about the solar system. I was beaming with pride, standing alone in a gymnasium full of families. Another page. My high school graduation. I was in my cap and gown, holding my diploma, standing in front of the school's main entrance. Alone. Patricia and Kenneth hadn't come. They'd said Victoria had a volleyball tournament that day that was more important. More pages. My college acceptance letter to NYU, which I held up to the camera with a smile that held both joy and uncertainty. I'd turned down NYU in the end. Kenneth had told me I was showing off by even applying to such a prestigious school, and Patricia had made it clear that if I moved across the country, I'd be on my own financially. I'd gone to University of Washington instead, staying close, staying available, staying grateful. Every major moment of my life was documented in this album. Birthday dinners I'd celebrated alone at cheap restaurants. Award ceremonies where I'd sat in auditoriums full of proud families while my chair remained empty. College move-in day where I'd hauled boxes up 3 flights of stairs by myself. "Where did you get these?" I'd whispered, tears streaming down my face. Dorothy had leaned forward and taken my hand. "I took them, Rachel. All of them. For 22 years I hired a private investigator to document your life. Every school event Kenneth and Patricia missed, I made sure someone was there. Photographing, recording, witnessing." "Why?" The word had come out broken. "Because someone needed to remember you, sweetheart. Someone needed to witness that you mattered." Dorothy's eyes had been fierce. I couldn't intervene directly. Kenneth is my son, and the family dynamics were complicated. Patricia had made it clear that if I pushed too hard, she'd cut off my access to you entirely. So I had to be strategic. I had to wait. But I never stopped watching. She'd told me then about the report cards I'd sent her every semester, how Patricia had intercepted them and thrown them away, but Dorothy had retrieved them through her investigator. About my college graduation, where Dorothy had sat in disguise in the back row watching me walk across that stage. About every moment of my life she'd documented, archived, saved. "You were never invisible, Rachel," she'd said, gripping my hands tightly. "I saw you. I've always seen you." Now standing in the Four Seasons ballroom with 300 people laughing at Victoria's cruel joke, I remembered Dorothy's words. I remembered her eyes, fierce and focused when she'd said them. And I understood finally that she hadn't just been documenting my life for sentiment. She'd been building evidence. As I walked toward the exit through the blur of tears and laughter, I didn't know that Grandma Dorothy had already set the wheels in motion. The family that destroyed me was about to face the reckoning of their lives. I'd made it maybe 20 feet toward the exit, my vision tunneling through unshed tears, when Dorothy's voice cut through the laughter like a blade through silk. "Wait, just a moment." The effect was instantaneous. The band's violinist drew his bow across the strings in a discordant screech as the music died. 300 conversations stopped mid-word. Even the waitstaff froze against the walls, champagne bottles suspended in mid-pour. The ballroom, which moments ago had been filled with cruel laughter, at my expense fell into a silence so complete I could hear the ice melting in the sculptures. I turned still near the back of the room and watched Dorothy rise from the family table with a deliberateness that made every movement seem choreographed. She was 82 years old, but in that moment she commanded the space like a general surveying a battlefield. Patricia recovered first, her face arranging itself into that placating smile she used when trying to control things spinning away from her grasp. "Mother Hayes, this really isn't the appropriate time. We're in the middle of celebrating Victoria's special day." "What's not appropriate," Dorothy interrupted, her voice slicing through Patricia's attempt at damage control, "is what I just witnessed." Patricia's smile fractured at the edges. Kenneth had half risen from his chair, his face going from champagne-flushed to ashen. Victoria stood uncertainly, still holding the microphone, suddenly looking very young and very confused. Dorothy gestured to someone in the crowd, and the wedding coordinator appeared, looking flustered, bringing a microphone. Then, as if materializing from thin air, a distinguished man in his 60s stepped forward from among the guests. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd done this before. Walter. I would later learn his name was. Dorothy's attorney for 30 years. Walter opened his briefcase and began setting up what looked like a portable document camera, the kind teachers use to project papers onto screens. The Four Seasons Ballroom had state-of-the-art AV equipment installed for the video montage Victoria had planned for later in the reception. Walter connected the camera to the system with practiced efficiency while 300 people watched in stunned silence. "I need everyone's attention," Dorothy said into the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "What I'm about to discuss concerns my estate, and I want there to be no confusion about what happens here tonight." Patricia made a small sound of protest, but Kenneth grabbed her arm, restraining her. Even he seemed to understand that something momentous was unfolding, something that had been set in motion long before tonight. 3 weeks ago, Dorothy continued, "I executed my final will and testament." She nodded to Walter, who placed a document under the camera. The image appeared on the screens positioned around the ballroom official letterhead, clearly visible notary stamps and signatures making it unmistakably legal. "This document has been properly witnessed, notarized, and filed with my attorneys. It is legally binding." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. "My estate," Dorothy said, her eyes sweeping across the crowd before landing on me, "currently valued at approximately $8 billion, will go entirely to my granddaughter Rachel Hayes." The gasps were audible, a wave of shock rippling through the guests. Patricia's scream cut through it like a siren. "Granddaughter, she's just some orphan Kenneth took in out of—" "We'll address the specifics of Rachel's parentage shortly," Dorothy said, her tone making it clear this interruption was both expected and irrelevant. "For now, what matters is this: the bulk of my estate goes to Rachel. However—" She paused, and I saw something calculating flash in her eyes. "I also established a separate trust fund 3 weeks ago, $2 million to be divided equally among Kenneth, Patricia, and Victoria." I saw Patricia's expression transform from outrage to greedy calculation. $2 million divided 3 ways. $666,000 each. Her fingers twitched like she was already counting it. Kenneth had gone completely still, his lawyer's mind probably already working through implications and possibilities. Victoria looked between her parents, her new husband whispering urgently in her ear. "This trust fund—" Dorothy continued, her gaze finding me again where I stood frozen near the exit. has one simple condition. The silence somehow deepened. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. If anyone in this family, Kenneth, Patricia, or Victoria, offers Rachel a sincere apology within the next 60 seconds, the trust will be distributed as planned. Each of you will receive $666,000. Dorothy pulled out her phone, her movements deliberate. If not, the trust will be dissolved immediately, and every dollar will be donated to St. Jude's Children's Hospital. Walter touched something on the AV system, and suddenly Dorothy's phone screen appeared on the projector, a timer app open and ready. 60 seconds, Dorothy said, her finger hovering over the start button. Beginning now. She tapped the screen. The numbers began their countdown: 0:59, 0:58, 0:57. The room was so quiet. I could hear the timer's digital ticking, could hear someone's sharp intake of breath, could hear the rustle of fabric as 300 people leaned forward in their seats. I stood there trembling, watching the numbers fall. Part of me, that desperate child who'd spent 22 years begging for scraps of affection, wanted them to apologize. Wanted Kenneth to stand up and say he was sorry. Wanted Patricia to admit she'd been cruel. Wanted Victoria to take back her words. Even now, even after everything, some small part of me still hoped. 00:50, 0:49, 0:48. Kenneth looked at Patricia. I saw his mouth start to open, saw him lean toward her. Patricia's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist hard enough that I could see her knuckles go white even from across the room. She leaned in close to his ear, but the microphone on their table caught her hissed words anyway. "She's bluffing. Don't you dare." 0:42, 0:41, 0:40. Victoria was panicking now, her carefully constructed poise crumbling. She grabbed her new husband's arm. "That's over $600,000. Just say sorry. Someone just say you're sorry." But even as she urged them, she didn't turn to me herself, didn't speak the words. Her pride wouldn't let her. 0:35, 0:34, 0:33. Guests began whispering urgently. I heard fragments. "Just apologize. It's only 2 words. $600,000. An elderly woman at table 4 actually stood up and called out, "Kenneth, for God's sake, apologize to the girl." But Patricia's grip on Kenneth's wrist tightened. Kenneth's face was gray sweat beading on his forehead, but he didn't move, didn't speak. 0:25, 0:24, 0:23. Dorothy stood perfectly still, watching her son with an expression of profound disappointment. This was a test, I realized, not just for the money. She was giving them one last chance to prove they had any decency left. One final opportunity to show that somewhere beneath the cruelty and the manipulation they were capable of basic human kindness. 0:15, 0:14, 0:13. Patricia's whisper carried through the ballroom's perfect acoustics, her voice shaking with fury and desperation. "We raised her. We put a roof over her head for 18 years. We don't owe her anything." 0:08, 0:07, 0:06. I realized with crystal clarity that they wouldn't do it. Even for $666,000 each, they wouldn't say 2 words. Wouldn't apologize for a lifetime of cruelty. Because apologizing would mean admitting they'd done something wrong. And in their minds, they hadn't. In their minds, I should still be grateful. Yeah. 0, P. 0, 2, 0, 0. Dorothy tapped her phone screen. The timer stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. "Time's up," Dorothy said softly. She looked at Kenneth, at Patricia, at Victoria, her expression carved from ice. "You just chose pride over $2 million. You couldn't manage 2 words in 60 seconds to claim $666,000 each." She shook her head slowly. That tells me everything I needed to know. She turned to Walter. Dissolve the trust immediately. Donate every dollar to St. Jude's Children's Hospital in my son Marcus Hayes' name. Walter nodded, already pulling out his phone to make the call. In 60 seconds of silence, they proved what I'd known for 22 years: I was never family. I was a transaction. And now they'd just lost the biggest deal of their lives. The ballroom exploded into chaos the moment Dorothy finished speaking. Patricia's scream was primal, raw with fury and disbelief. She lunged from her chair so violently that it toppled backward, hitting the floor with a crash that made several guests jump. "You can't do this. I'll sue. That money belongs to Kenneth. He's your son." Kenneth was on his feet too, trying to grab his wife's arm while simultaneously reaching toward Dorothy with his other hand, his face a mask of desperation. "Mom, please, let's talk about this privately. We can work this out. You don't understand what you're doing." But Dorothy wasn't looking at them anymore. She was looking at me, her expression softening from granite to something almost tender. She walked toward me with steady, measured steps, and when she reached me near the exit, she took my hand in both of hers. "We're leaving. Now." I couldn't speak, couldn't process what had just happened. I simply nodded, letting her lead me like a child, my legs moving on autopilot, while my mind spun in circles trying to catch up. Walter was already beside us, briefcase in hand, moving with the efficient grace of someone who'd coordinated this exit strategy long before tonight. Around us, the wedding reception had descended into complete pandemonium. Victoria was sobbing, mascara running in black rivers down her face, her new husband looking shell-shocked and confused. Guests were pulling out their phones, some filming openly, others texting frantically. This would be on social media before we even left the parking lot. We were nearly to the side exit when Patricia broke free from Kenneth's restraining grip and charged toward us. 2 security guards materialized, also prearranged, I realized dimly, and intercepted her before she could reach Dorothy, but her voice carried across the ballroom, shrill and accusatory. "That money belongs to Kenneth. He's your son, your flesh and blood. How can you give everything to some orphan girl over your own child?" Dorothy stopped. For a moment I thought she might keep walking, might let the statement hang unanswered in the air. But then she turned slowly and looked back at Patricia with an expression that could have frozen fire. "And Marcus was my son too," Dorothy said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a judge delivering a verdict. "The son you let die a second time by erasing his daughter from existence. You took everything from her, her name, her history, her inheritance, and you had the audacity to make her grateful for it." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, rippling out through the stunned crowd. Kenneth's face crumpled, and for the first time in my memory, I saw him cry. Not the quiet, restrained tears of a man trying to maintain dignity, but ugly, heaving sobs that shook his entire body. Dorothy turned away from him and guided me through the exit. The heavy door closed behind us, muffling the sounds of the wedding-turned-disaster. A sleek black limousine waited at the curb, engine-running driver standing at attention by the open door. Of course it was prearranged. Dorothy had planned every moment of this. As we slid into the leather interior and the car pulled away from the Four Seasons, I looked back through the rear window. Through the glass doors of the ballroom, I could see Patricia collapsed in Kenneth's arms, her body racked with sobs. Victoria stood alone in her $15,000 dress, surrounded by guests who didn't know whether to comfort her or record this disaster for posterity. The ice sculptures were still melting. The band stood frozen on their stage, and my $32,000 sat scattered across that beautiful room like the wreckage of a shipwreck. Inside the limousine, I was shaking so hard my teeth chattered. Dorothy wrapped a cashmere throw around my shoulders, but I couldn't get warm. My mind kept trying to process what had just happened, but the pieces wouldn't fit together into any coherent picture. "What just happened?" I finally managed to whisper. "What did you mean, granddaughter?" Dorothy took both my hands in hers, her grip firm and anchoring. Her eyes, those sharp blue eyes that had witnessed decades of joy and loss, filled with tears. "Sweetheart, There's so much you don't know. And I'm sorry, so deeply sorry that I waited this long to tell you." She took a breath, steadying herself. "Your father was Marcus Hayes, Kenneth's younger brother, my youngest son." The words didn't make sense at first. I stared at her, waiting for them to arrange themselves into something comprehensible. "When Marcus and your mother died in that accident in 2003, Kenneth was listed as next of kin. He had every legal right to take custody of you. But Kenneth knew exactly who you were, Rachel. He knew you were my granddaughter. He knew you were his brother's child, his niece, his blood, and he hid it." "Why?" The question came out broken. "Because your parents left you a trust fund, $750,000. Life insurance savings, everything they'd built for your future." Dorothy's voice hardened. "If people knew you were Marcus's daughter, you'd have had legal rights to that money, rights they couldn't easily manipulate. Eventually, you'd have had claims to my estate as well. So Kenneth and Patricia made a choice. They told everyone you were just some distant connection, some orphan child they'd taken in out of the goodness of their hearts. They adopted you under their last name Turner, instead of letting you keep Hayes. They buried your identity so deeply that even you forgot who you really were." I felt like I was falling, like the ground had opened beneath me, and I was tumbling through empty space. "I've been your granddaughter this whole time." "Since the day you were born," Dorothy confirmed, tears now spilling down her cheeks. "I found out through a DNA test at the hospital right after the accident. Hospital protocol required proof of relationship before releasing certain information. Kenneth was there when the results came back. He saw them with his own eyes, saw proof that you were Marcus's daughter, that you were my blood." "But you never told me," I said, not accusing, just trying to understand. "I told Kenneth we should keep it quiet for a while, until you were older, to protect you from the complications of estate planning and inheritance questions. You'd just lost your parents. You were traumatized, grieving. I thought we were giving you time to heal before adding more complexity to your life." Dorothy's hands tightened on mine. "But Kenneth used that silence to erase you completely. He and Patricia turned my protection into a weapon. They used my own strategy against you, and I didn't realize it until it was too late. By the time I understood what they were doing, you were already so damaged, already so conditioned to believe you were nothing." I thought about all those years, all those moments when Kenneth had looked uncomfortable but said nothing. All those times I'd felt like something was wrong, but couldn't name what. He'd known. Every single day he'd known I was his brother's daughter, and he'd let Patricia treat me like garbage anyway. "I've spent 22 years gathering evidence," Dorothy said, her voice taking on that steel edge I'd heard in the ballroom. "Bank records, witness testimonies, documentation of every cruelty, every lie. Tonight was the final test. I wanted to give them one last chance to show they had any decency left, any capacity for basic human kindness. They failed spectacularly." She reached for Walter's briefcase, which sat on the seat beside her. Opening it, she pulled out folders thick with documents, photographs, highlighted bank statements. "Tomorrow we go to war. We're going to take back everything they stole from you, your money, your name, your dignity, your history, all of it." "Why now?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer from the way she'd moved tonight, from the careful deliberation of someone working against a deadline. Dorothy's face softened with sadness. "Because I'm dying, sweetheart. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. I don't have time to be patient anymore, don't have time to wait for them to change or grow or suddenly develop consciences." She squeezed my hands. "But I have enough time. Enough time to make sure you get justice, to make sure the truth comes out, to make sure you inherit what's rightfully yours." The limousine was gliding through Seattle's nighttime streets, heading toward an address I didn't recognize. Through my tears, I watched the city lights blur past each one, a small point of clarity in a world that had just been turned completely upside down. As we pulled up to an estate I would later learn was Dorothy's home. She said something that would define everything to come. Her voice quiet but absolutely certain. "They took 22 years from you, Rachel. We're going to take their next 22 years from them, And we'll do it legally, publicly, and completely. The limousine turned onto a private drive that wound through towering evergreens, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the moonlight into silver patterns on the pavement. When the trees finally parted, I saw the house for the first time and understood immediately why Patricia had spent 22 years keeping me away from it. Dorothy's estate sat on the shores of Lake Washington, like something out of a dream, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the water's dark surface. It wasn't a gaudy mansion trying to prove its worth through excess. It was elegant, understated, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because it had nothing to prove. The property had to be worth $40 million, at least maybe more, and as the car pulled up to the entrance, I felt something crack open inside my chest. This was my grandmother's home. This place had existed my entire life, just across the city, while I'd grown up in rooms with bare walls and hand-me-down furniture, believing I should be grateful for even that. Dorothy led me inside, her hand steady on my elbow as if she knew my legs might give out at any moment. The interior took my breath away. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine stretched beneath my feet. Original artwork hung on walls painted in warm, inviting colors. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister carved from dark wood that gleamed with decades of careful maintenance. But what struck me most was the library I glimpsed through an open doorway, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound books, a rolling ladder attached to brass rails, the kind of room I'd dreamed about as a child who'd loved to read but never had more than a handful of books at a time. "Come," Dorothy said softly, guiding me up the staircase. "I want to show you something." She led me down a hallway lined with photographs, and I recognized faces in some of them. Dorothy as a younger woman standing in front of construction sites in various stages of completion. The real estate empire she'd built over 50 years, brick by brick, deal by deal. Then other photos more personal. Two boys, maybe 8 and 5 years old, grinning at the camera with gap-toothed smiles. Kenneth and Marcus, I realized. My father as a child, his eyes bright with mischief and joy. Dorothy stopped in front of a door near the end of the hall and opened it. "This was going to be your room," she said. "I had it prepared years ago, waiting for the day you'd finally come home." The room was beautiful. Not decorated for a child, but for a young woman. Soft gray walls, white furniture with clean lines, a bed with a plush duvet in pale blue. Watercolor paintings of the Seattle skyline hung above a desk positioned to catch the natural light from windows that overlooked the lake. Bookshelves already filled with classics and contemporary novels. A comfortable reading chair in the corner with a floor lamp beside it. Someone had put thought into this room, had imagined the person who would live here, and what she might need to feel safe and loved. But it was the nightstand that destroyed me. There, in a simple silver frame, was a photograph I'd never seen before. A man in his early 30s held a tiny baby swaddled in a pink blanket. He was looking down at her with an expression of such pure, unguarded love that it hurt to witness. The baby's eyes were open, dark, and unfocused, one small hand visible above the blanket's edge. "That's Marcus holding you," Dorothy said quietly. "About 3 hours after you were born. He called me from the hospital crying because he was so happy. He said, 'Mom, I didn't know I could love anything this much.'" I picked up the frame with shaking hands. My father. I tried to pull his features from the depths of memory, but nothing came except fragments, impressions. The smell of his cologne. The sound of his laugh. The way he used to spin me around until I was dizzy with joy. Patricia had destroyed every photo, erased every tangible reminder of who I'd come from, and I'd been too young to hold on to more than ghosts. "I haven't seen his face since I was 7 years old," I whispered, tears flowing freely now. Dorothy sat on the edge of the bed and pulled me down beside her, letting me cry against her shoulder the way I should have been allowed to cry 22 years ago when my world first shattered. When I could breathe again, she led me back downstairs to her study. Walter was waiting there, surrounded by banker's boxes stacked against the walls. He stood when we entered, his expression grave but kind. "Rachel," he said, extending his hand formally, I've been your grandmother's attorney for 30 years. I'm going to be yours now too, if you'll have me. I shook his hand, still feeling disconnected from my body, from reality, from everything I'd thought I knew about my life. Walter gestured to the boxes. What you're looking at is 22 years of documentation. Your grandmother didn't just watch you grow up from a distance. She investigated. She collected evidence. He opened the nearest box and pulled out a folder. Bank records showing every withdrawal Kenneth and Patricia made from your trust fund between 2003 and 2021. $750,000 transferred systematically into their personal accounts and spent on everything from vacations to Victoria's car to home renovations. He pulled out another folder. School records documenting every academic achievement they ignored. Teacher testimonies about parent-teacher conferences they never attended. Your middle school principal's statement about the time you won a regional writing competition and they didn't even pick up the trophy. Another folder. Medical records from your hospitalization at 16. The nurses documented that your guardians visited once for less than 30 minutes during a 5-day stay. The evidence kept coming, box after box, a mountain of proof that my entire childhood had been exactly as cruel and calculated as I'd always felt it was but had been taught to deny. Your grandmother has built an airtight case, Walter said. We're filing a civil lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and embezzlement. We're suing for the return of your trust fund, $750,000, plus 22 years of compound interest and damages. How much would that be? I asked, my voice barely audible. Approximately $2.1 million, Walter said, plus punitive damages we'll argue for at trial. We intend to make this very, very expensive for them. Dorothy stood and walked to a wall safe I hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a painting. She opened it and removed a leather portfolio which she brought to me. Sit down, sweetheart, she said. I sat. She opened the portfolio to reveal financial statements that made my vision swim. Numbers with so many zeros I had to count them twice to believe what I was seeing. My net worth is approximately $8 billion, Dorothy said calmly, as if she were discussing the weather. Real estate holdings, investment portfolios, stock positions built over 50 years. As of 3 weeks ago, when I executed my will, it's all yours. I couldn't speak, couldn't process numbers that large. $8 billion. It was incomprehensible. I can't accept this, I finally managed. It's too much I didn't earn. It's not charity, Dorothy interrupted firmly. You're my granddaughter. This is your birthright. Marcus should have inherited half of this someday, but he died. Kenneth was supposed to inherit the other half. Her expression hardened. But Kenneth betrayed his brother's memory by erasing you, by stealing from you, by allowing his wife to abuse you for 2 decades. So he gets nothing. She pulled out another document, medical records with a hospital logo at the top. I'm dying, Rachel. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It's metastasized to my liver, my lungs. The doctors give me 4 to 6 months, possibly less. The room tilted. I'd just found her. Just discovered I had a grandmother who'd been fighting for me all along, and now she was telling me she was leaving. I've declined aggressive treatment, Dorothy continued. At 82, I've lived a full life. I'm ready. But I'm not leaving until I see you restored, until the truth comes out, until you're safe and whole and in possession of everything that's rightfully yours. She took my face in her hands, forcing me to meet her eyes. You're not just inheriting money, sweetheart. You're inheriting a mission. To expose what they did. To help other children who are being abused in plain sight the way you were. To build something that lasts, something that matters, something that transforms pain into protection for others. That's the real legacy I'm leaving you. That night, I lay in the bed that had been prepared for me years ago, in the room that had waited patiently for me to finally come home. I held the photograph of my father holding me as a baby, traced the lines of his face with my finger, and let myself remember what Dorothy had told me about his joy the day I was born. I'd spent my whole life begging for scraps from people who'd stolen my kingdom. Now I was going to take it back, crown and all. I woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and spent a disoriented moment trying to remember where I was. Then it all came rushing back, the wedding, Dorothy's revelation, the photograph of my father on the nightstand beside me. I reached for it instinctively, needing to confirm that last night had been real, that I hadn't dreamed the entire thing. The smell of coffee drew me downstairs, where I found Dorothy and Walter already seated at the dining room table. The morning light reflected off Lake Washington through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the water into liquid silver. But it was the table itself that made me stop in the doorway. Every inch was covered with documents, bank statements, ledgers, highlighted spreadsheets arranged in neat chronological stacks. "Good morning, sweetheart," Dorothy said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Coffee's hot. You should eat something before we begin. This is going to be difficult." Walter stood and poured me coffee in a delicate china cup, then pushed a plate of pastries toward me. I sat, my stomach too knotted to even consider food, staring at the paper trail of my stolen life spread before me. "I want to walk you through this carefully," Walter said, settling into what I recognized as his lawyer mode, calm, methodical, precise. "In 2003, immediately following your parents' death and Kenneth's assumption of guardianship, a trust fund was established in your name. The initial deposit was $750,000, composed of your parents' life insurance policies, their savings accounts, and the liquidation of certain assets. This was your inheritance, Rachel. Everything Marcus and your mother had built for your future." He slid the first document toward me. I recognized Kenneth's signature at the bottom, right above the words, "Legal Guardian." "The fund was structured with specific restrictions," Walter continued. "The money was to remain untouched and invested conservatively until you turned 18. At that point, it would transfer entirely into your control. Kenneth, as your legal guardian, was permitted to make withdrawals only for expenses directly benefiting you: education, medical care, essential needs. Every withdrawal required documentation proving it was for your benefit." He pulled out another stack of papers, these covered in red highlighter marks. "Starting in 2004, when you were 6 years old, the withdrawals began. $50,000 for Rachel's private school tuition." Walter looked at me over his reading glasses. "You attended public school your entire life, correct?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. $30,000 for Rachel's medical expenses in 2007. According to your medical records, you were healthy that year. No hospitalizations, no chronic conditions requiring treatment." He kept going, his voice never wavering from that professional tone, even as each number landed like a physical blow. $75,000 for Rachel's college fund in 2010. Yet you paid for your own education through scholarships and student loans, working part-time at the library to cover your living expenses. The list went on. Vacations to Hawaii disguised as educational trips for Rachel's cultural development. A new car for Victoria listed as transportation for Rachel's school activities. Patricia's cosmetic surgeries documented as medical expenses for household. Kenneth's failed restaurant venture funded by a withdrawal marked Rachel's entrepreneurship education program. By 2021, the account was completely empty, Walter said, sliding the final statement toward me. $750,000 gone, spent on everything except you. I stared at the zero balance, feeling something cold and hard crystallizing in my chest. They hadn't just stolen money. They'd stolen it while making me feel grateful for scraps, while telling me I should thank them for the burden of raising me. "There's more," Walter said quietly. He stood and walked to a cabinet I hadn't noticed, returning with an old cassette player, the kind I hadn't seen since childhood. He placed it on the table along with a cassette tape in a clear plastic case labeled in Dorothy's precise handwriting, November 2005, Kenneth Hayes. "What is this?" I asked. "Listen," Walter said simply, and pressed play. Static crackled, then voices emerged, tinny but clear. A man I didn't recognize. "Mr. Hayes, I'm looking at Rachel's trust fund account. The balance is currently $700,000. You're requesting access to $50,000, Kenneth's voice younger but unmistakable. Yes, for Rachel's expenses. I need to remind you that this fund is restricted. Withdrawals must be for Rachel's direct benefit, and you'll need to provide documentation proving that. She's only 7 years old. This money is meant to last until she's 18. A pause. Then, Kenneth, his voice taking on a casual tone that made my skin crawl. What if she doesn't know about it? The fund, I mean. The banker's discomfort was audible even through decades-old recording equipment. Sir, that would be legally problematic. As her guardian, you have a fiduciary duty to protect her interests, which includes informing her of assets held in her name. She's 7, Kenneth said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, the calculation. By the time she's 18, she'll be too busy being grateful we took her in to ask questions about money she never knew existed. Another pause. Besides, my mother doesn't need to know every detail of how I manage the household finances. The tape clicked off. I sat staring at the cassette player, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the table. Your grandmother was in the room when this conversation happened, Walter explained. She was visiting Kenneth's house sitting on the couch in his home office. They thought she'd fallen asleep. She hadn't. She'd brought a tape recorder in her purse. Washington is a 2-party consent state for recordings, but Dorothy was one of the 2 parties in that room. The recording is completely legal. I looked at Dorothy, who'd been silent throughout this entire presentation. She met my eyes with an expression that mixed sorrow and steel. He knew, I whispered. From the beginning, he knew exactly what he was doing. Yes, Dorothy said simply. If they stole everything, I said, my voice breaking. How do I have anything to fight with? How can I afford lawyers, court costs, any of this? Dorothy's expression shifted into something almost like a smile. She reached for a folder I hadn't noticed, burgundy leather embossed with a bank logo. Because they didn't know about everything, sweetheart. She opened the folder and slid a document across the table. A life insurance policy yellowed slightly with age, dated May 2003. The name at the top, Marcus Hayes. Benefit amount $1 million. Beneficiary, Dorothy Hayes. Your father didn't trust Kenneth with money, Dorothy said. Brothers know each other's weaknesses, and Marcus knew his brother was easily influenced, especially by Patricia. So when Marcus took out this life insurance policy after you were born, he listed me as the beneficiary, not Kenneth. She showed me a note, paper-clipped to the policy in handwriting I didn't recognize, but somehow knew was my father's "Mom for Rachel's future when she's old enough to handle it. Keep it safe from Kenneth. He means well, but Patricia will get to him. Protect our girl. M." My vision blurred with tears as I traced my father's words with my finger. I opened a trust account the day I received this payout, Dorothy continued. Dorothy Hayes in trust for Rachel Hayes. I invested it conservatively, index funds, government bonds, blue-chip stocks, nothing risky. Over 22 years with compound interest and reinvested dividends, that $1 million has grown. She slid another statement toward me. Current balance, 627 then. 394.82. This is yours, Rachel, Dorothy said. It's been sitting in that account growing waiting for you. Your father protected you from beyond the grave, and I honored his wishes by keeping it safe until the day you'd need it most. I stared at the number, trying to comprehend it. While I'd been living in a 1-bedroom apartment teaching spelling to 5th graders, eating ramen to save money for a down payment on a house I'd never afford, I'd had nearly $6 million waiting for me. Money my father had left me. Money Dorothy had protected. Money Kenneth and Patricia had never known existed. They'd stolen my past, erased my identity, taken the inheritance my parents had left me. But my father and grandmother had built me a future they couldn't touch. Now I had both the money and the proof to take them down. The only question was, how hard did I want to hit back? 1 week after the wedding, Walter walked into the King County Superior Court and filed a civil complaint that would change everything. I sat in Dorothy's study when he called to confirm it was done, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea I couldn't bring myself to drink. It's public record now, Walter said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. Rachel Hayes versus Kenneth Hayes, Patricia Turner Hayes, and Victoria Hayes Morrison. Breach of fiduciary duty, embezzlement, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We're seeking the return of the $750,000 trust fund plus 22 years of compound interest at the legal rate, which brings us to $2.1 million. And we're asking for $5 million in punitive damages. $7.1 million total. The number felt surreal. The media will have it within the hour, Walter continued. Are you ready for what comes next? I wasn't sure I was ready for anything, but I heard myself say yes anyway. He was right about the timing. Within 2 hours, my phone started buzzing with news alerts. Wedding humiliation leads to $7 million lawsuit. Adopted daughter sues family for stolen inheritance. Billionaire's granddaughter exposes decades of abuse. The story spread like wildfire, helped along by the videos that wedding guests had posted online. Clips of Dorothy's 60-second challenge had already gone viral, but now they were being shared with new context, new outrage. Victoria's cruel toast played on loop across social media platforms, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she told me to find another table. My phone started ringing before the first news cycle had even finished. Kenneth's name appeared on my screen again and again. I watched it ring, feeling Dorothy's hand on my shoulder, and let every call go to voicemail. The messages he left told their own story, a progression from anger to desperation that would have been pathetic if it weren't so infuriating. The first one, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Rachel, this is insane. Call me back immediately. We need to talk about this before you do something you'll regret. An hour later, you're going to destroy this family over money. After everything we did for you, I can't believe you'd be this ungrateful. By evening, his tone had shifted to pleading. Please, Rachel. We can work this out. I'm your father. We raised you. Doesn't that count for something? Just talk to me. The final message left at 11 p.m. was directed at Dorothy. Not me, Mom, please, you're sick. You're not thinking clearly. Rachel is manipulating you. She's turned you against your own son. This isn't what you want. Dad wouldn't have wanted this. I deleted them all without listening to them a second time. Patricia's response was more calculated. 3 days after the filing, a letter arrived via courier sent from her attorney. Walter opened it in front of me, his expression darkening as he read. She was threatening a countersuit for defamation and elder abuse, claiming I was taking advantage of Dorothy's deteriorating mental state to manipulate her into disinheriting her rightful son. The letter painted me as a gold digger who'd waited until Dorothy was dying to make my move conveniently, ignoring the 22 years of documented abuse and the $750,000 they'd stolen. Standard intimidation tactics, Walter said, setting the letter aside. She has no case. Dorothy's medical records show she's completely lucid. Her oncologist will testify to that if needed. This is just noise. Victoria's approach was the most public and the most foolish. She posted on Instagram a carefully staged photo of herself looking pensively out a window, caption reading, "When family drama gets out of control, some people just want attention and money. It's sad when you realize not everyone wishes you well. Prayers for healing." The comments section became a battlefield within minutes. Her friends posted supportive messages, but they were drowned out by thousands of others who'd seen the videos. One comment, liked over 50,000 times, read, "Girl, she paid for your wedding, and you humiliated her in front of 300 people. You called her adopted girl like it was a slur. You deserve everything coming to you, and more." Walter called 4 days after filing to tell me we needed to control the narrative before Patricia's lies gained traction. He'd arranged a press conference at his firm's downtown office, a sleek glass building that spoke of success and legitimacy. I spent the night before writing and rewriting my statement, crossing out words, starting over until Dorothy finally took the paper from my hands. "Just tell the truth," she said. "That's all you need to do." The conference room was packed with reporters when I walked in, cameras and microphones creating a wall of attention I'd spent my whole life avoiding. But I'd also spent my whole life being silent, and I was done with that. I read my statement with hands that only shook a little. I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this for truth. For 22 years, I was told I should be grateful to be chosen, but I wasn't chosen. I was inherited, then exploited. My parents left me $750,000 to ensure I'd have a future. I thought about my answer carefully. I regret believing that love could be bought, but I don't regret finding out the truth. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are the most valuable. Another reporter from a local TV station. What would you say to your family if they're watching? I looked directly into the camera, thinking of Kenneth and Patricia and Victoria, watching this from wherever they were probably plotting their next move. Justice doesn't negotiate, and I'm done begging for what's already mine. As I walked out of the press conference, Walter's hand on my elbow, guiding me through the crowd of reporters still shouting questions, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I glanced at the screen. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. We'll bury you. I stopped walking, screenshot the message, and forwarded it to Walter. His phone chimed. He looked at it, and a slow smile spread across his face. He typed back a response I could see over his shoulder. Perfect. That's called witness intimidation. Screenshot it. We'll use it in court. The threat text was just the beginning. Within 48 hours, the lawsuit had exploded across every corner of the internet. I made the mistake of searching my own name once and fell down a rabbit hole I couldn't climb out of for hours. TikTok was flooded with reaction videos, young people filming themselves watching the wedding clips, their faces progressing from confusion to shock to outrage. Reddit threads dissected every detail, amateur internet detectives pulling up property records and tax filings tracking the family's spending patterns over 2 decades. Twitter was a fire hose of opinions, the hashtag #HatchJustice. For Rachel trending nationally for 3 consecutive days. The wedding videos had been viewed over 15 million times. Someone had edited together a compilation. Victoria's cruel toast, Patricia's barely concealed laughter, Kenneth's cowardly silence, all set to somber music. It ended with Dorothy's 60-second timer counting down to 0 while the family sat in stubborn, greedy silence. The comments sections were brutal. Imagine being so heartless you can't apologize for $666K. They really thought she'd just take it forever. This is every adoptee's worst nightmare made public. Memes proliferated with disturbing speed. Screenshots of Victoria saying, "adopted girl," with captions mocking her entitlement. Side-by-side comparisons of Rachel's modest teacher salary versus the family's luxury purchases, all funded by her stolen inheritance. Someone even created a GoFundMe to support Rachel's legal fees, which I had Walter shut down immediately. I didn't need crowdfunding. I had $5.6 million and the best attorney in Seattle. But the internet wasn't uniformly on my side. Conservative talk show hosts seized on the story as evidence of generational entitlement. This is what's wrong with millennials today. One particularly bombastic commentator ranted. A family takes in an orphan, raises her for 18 years, and she thanks them with a $7 million lawsuit. Where's the gratitude? Where's the respect for the people who gave her a home? Even some adoptee advocacy groups were divided. Most supported me publicly, recognizing the abuse for what it was. But a vocal minority published op-eds arguing I was airing private family matters in a way that stigmatizes adoption and contributing to harmful narratives about adoptive families. Reading those hurt more than the outright attacks, the suggestion that by exposing my abuse, I was somehow betraying other adoptees. The tabloids had a field day with Dorothy's diagnosis. "Dying billionaire's last revenge," screamed one headline above an unflattering photo of Dorothy leaving a medical appointment. "Grandma's $8 billion, middle finger to her son," declared another. They speculated about her mental competence, her motivations, whether I was a master manipulator who'd seduced a sick old woman into disinheriting her rightful heirs. I hated all of it, the circus of strangers dissecting my pain for entertainment and outrage. I told Walter as much when he came for our daily strategy session. I know it's unpleasant, he said, not unsympathetically, but public pressure helps our case. Judges are human, they read the news, they scroll social media. When Kenneth and Patricia walk into that courtroom, the judge will already know who they are and what they've done. That matters. Patricia understood this too, which was why she hired a crisis PR firm within a week of the lawsuit going public. I found out about her television interview the morning it was scheduled to air when Walter called to warn me. Don't watch it, he advised. It'll just upset you and nothing she says will matter in court. Of course I watched it. I sat in Dorothy's living room with her beside me, both of us staring at the screen as Patricia settled into an overstuffed chair across from a sympathetic morning show host. Patricia had chosen her setting carefully, their suburban home mortgaged to the hilt, though she'd never admit it, decorated to look humble and lived in. She wore a simple sweater, minimal makeup tissues clutched in one hand. "Thank you for giving me the chance to tell my side," Patricia began, her voice already wavering with manufactured emotion. "I loved Rachel like my own daughter. We gave her everything we had, a home, stability, education. Were we perfect? No parent is. But we tried our best with a traumatized child who'd lost everything." The host leaned forward with practiced empathy. "You're accused of stealing her trust fund. What's your response?" Patricia dabbed at her eyes. "That money went to raising Rachel. Food on the table, clothes on her back, a roof over her head for 18 years. We have receipts for everything." This was a lie and we both knew it. What people don't understand is that Kenneth's mother has never forgiven me for marrying her son. She's always been cold to me, always looking for ways to undermine our family. Now she's dying and she's using Rachel as a weapon to hurt us. "So you believe Rachel is being manipulated?" the host asked. "I think Rachel is a vulnerable young woman who's been brainwashed by a bitter, dying billionaire with an axe to grind," Patricia said, and I felt Dorothy's hand tighten on my arm. "Dorothy is making Rachel believe lies about her childhood, turning her against the only family she's ever known. Honestly, I think Rachel needs psychological help. She's not well." I was on my feet before I knew I was moving, rage flooding through me so intensely I felt dizzy. "She's lying. She's lying about everything. I wore clothes from Goodwill while Victoria got Nordstrom. I worked 2 jobs to pay for college while they took vacations to Europe." Dorothy's hand on my shoulder was firm, pulling me back down to the couch. "Let her talk," Dorothy said calmly. "Lies unravel in court." But she also turned to me with an expression I was learning to recognize, the look of a teacher presenting a lesson. "Notice what she's doing, Rachel. She's playing the victim. She's questioning your mental state. She's painting me as the villain and herself as the martyred mother. These are classic narcissist tactics when they're exposed." "So what do we do?" I asked, trying to match Dorothy's calm when everything in me wanted to scream. Dorothy smiled, and there was something almost predatory in it. "We let the truth speak. Walter has the bank records showing every fraudulent withdrawal. He has the tape recording of Kenneth planning to hide your inheritance. He has witness testimonies from teachers and neighbors who saw how you were treated. Patricia can perform for the cameras all she wants, can cry her crocodile tears for every morning show in America. But she can't perform in a courtroom under oath. The moment she's forced to answer questions, she can't rehearse. The moment she has to face actual evidence instead of sympathetic hosts, everything falls apart." I watched Patricia on the screen, dabbing at her eyes, her voice breaking at precisely calculated moments, and I started to understand. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money. It was about exposing a pattern of psychological abuse that had thrived for decades in shadows and silence. Patricia had controlled the narrative my entire life, had told everyone who would listen that she was the generous savior and I was the grateful charity case. Now, for the first time, she didn't control the story anymore, and she was terrified. Patricia thought she could cry her way out of accountability. She didn't know that every lie she told on television was being documented by our legal team, every contradiction noted, every false claim recorded for future impeachment. In chess, they call this giving your opponent rope. We were about to watch her hang herself with it. 2 weeks after Patricia's television performance, Walter decided it was time to stop playing defense. He organized a formal press conference at the Grand Hyatt in downtown Seattle, sending invitations to every major news outlet in the Pacific Northwest. When Rachel and I arrived, the conference room was packed with journalists, cameras on tripods, voice recorders scattered across the table where we'd be sitting. Dorothy looked frailer than she had at the wedding, the cancer eating away at her with visible hunger, but her eyes were as sharp as ever when she took her seat beside me. Walter stood at the podium, composed and professional in his charcoal suit. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "We're here today to respond to recent allegations that this lawsuit is frivolous, that Rachel Hayes is manipulating a dying woman, that the family did nothing wrong. I'm not going to argue with words. I'm going to let the evidence speak for itself." He nodded to his assistant who operated the projection system. The screen behind us lit up with a bank statement, the header reading, "Rachel Hayes Trust Fund, Guardian Account." This account was opened in 2003 with an initial deposit of $750,000, Walter said. By 2021, the balance was zero. Let me show you where the money went. The screen changed to show a spreadsheet, each withdrawal highlighted and annotated. $50,000, March 2004, labeled, "Rachel Hayes, Private School Tuition." Walter clicked to the next slide, Rachel's elementary school enrollment records clearly showing attendance at Cedar Ridge Public Elementary. $30,000, July 2007, labeled, "Rachel Hayes, Medical Expenses." Another click, medical records showing a healthy 7-year-old with routine checkups and no hospitalizations. $75,000, September 2010, labeled, "Rachel Hayes, College Fund." Click student loan documents in Rachel's name, work study records from the University of Washington Library. The evidence continued withdrawal after fraudulent withdrawal, each one meticulously documented and cross-referenced with proof that the money had never been spent on Rachel. Walter paused, letting the silence emphasize the weight of what we'd presented. "We also have an affidavit from Rachel's high school counselor, Mrs. Eleanor Rodriguez." The screen showed a notarized statement. Walter read it aloud. "Rachel Hayes came to my office in tears during her junior year. She wanted to apply to colleges but told me her family couldn't afford it. I helped her apply for scholarships and work-study programs. Meanwhile, her sister Victoria drove a new BMW to school every day. I remember thinking something was very wrong in that household." Dorothy took the microphone, then her hands trembling slightly as she gripped it. When she spoke, her voice was weak but carried the force of 22 years of restrained fury. "My son Kenneth and his wife Patricia didn't just steal money," she said. "They stole my granddaughter's childhood, her sense of self-worth, her right to know who she really was." The screen changed again, showing photographs from Dorothy's secret album. 8-year-old Rachel pushing a lawnmower in summer heat, while Victoria sat in a pool in the background. 12-year-old Rachel carrying serving trays at a family gathering, her face carefully neutral while adults laughed and ignored her. The hospital photo that made my chest tighten, 16-year-old Rachel in a hospital bed, pale and alone, the timestamp showing 2:47 a.m. This photo was taken during Rachel's 5-day hospitalization for pneumonia, Dorothy said. Patricia Hayes visited once for 23 minutes on day 2. Kenneth came with her and left after 15 minutes. For the remaining 4 days and 23 hours, Rachel was alone. I watched the journalists scribbling notes, saw a few of them exchange glances that mixed disgust with recognition. This was the story they'd been hoping for, the evidence that confirmed what the viral videos had suggested. "I watched for 22 years, Dorothy continued, her voice breaking. "I documented everything, hoping they would change, praying they would show even a shred of decency. They never did. So I waited for the day Rachel would be strong enough to hear the truth, strong enough to fight back. That day is today." She turned to look directly at the cameras. "This isn't about money. It's about child abuse disguised as charity. It's about a family that took a traumatized 5-year-old and turned her into an unpaid servant while spending her inheritance on luxury vacations. And I will spend my last breath making sure everyone knows what they did." Walter was returning to the podium when the commotion started at the back of the room. Security was trying to block someone, voices rising in protest, and then Victoria burst through, her face blotchy and streaked with mascara. She had her phone clutched in one hand, and I realized she'd been watching the live stream. "You're destroying us!" she screamed, storming toward our table. Cameras swiveled to capture her, journalists standing for a better view. "That money paid for your life. We earned it by putting up with you for 18 years. Walter stepped forward, hands raised in a calming gesture. "Ms. Morrison, this isn't an appropriate venue." "Appropriate?" Victoria's voice climbed toward hysteria. "She lived in our house. She ate our food. That trust fund was compensation for dealing with someone else's orphan." The room had gone completely silent. Every camera was recording. Every journalist was frantically typing or scribbling notes. Victoria pointed at me, her fingers shaking with rage. "You were nothing when we took you in. Nothing. We made you. We gave you a life, and this is how you repay us." I stood slowly, meeting her eyes across the room. "Are you done?" Something in my voice, or maybe in my expression, seemed to penetrate her fury. Victoria's face changed, realization dawning as she looked around at the cameras, at the journalists, at the evidence still displayed on the screen behind me. I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, but the damage was catastrophically complete. Walter's smile was barely perceptible, professional mask firmly in place. "Thank you, Ms. Morrison. You've just confessed on camera to viewing a child as a financial transaction. A child whose inheritance you helped spend while calling her a charity case, all on the record, all admissible in court." Security finally caught up to her, two men in hotel uniforms gently but firmly taking her arms. As they escorted her toward the exit, I could hear her sobbing, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean it like that. That's not what I meant." But she had meant it exactly like that, and now the whole world knew. For the first time in my life, the truth was louder than their lies. Victoria's meltdown was clipped and online before we'd even left the hotel. By the time Dorothy and I returned to the estate, my phone was exploding with notifications. The soundbite had been isolated, sharpened, and set loose across every platform. "We earned it by putting up with you for 18 years. Her voice, shrill with entitlement and rage, played on loop across millions of screens. The view counter climbed with dizzying speed. 5 million in the first hour, 10 million by dinner time, 15 million within 24 hours. It wasn't just the raw clip either. Commentary channels were dissecting every word, every facial expression, the way her fingers shook when she pointed at me the moment realization dawned that she'd confessed on camera. Legal analysts appeared on CNN and MSNBC, debating whether Victoria's statement constituted an admission of fraud, whether it could be used to pierce the corporate veil, whether her words amounted to a confession of conspiracy. Then, the celebrities started weighing in. A famous actress, someone I'd admired for years. Someone who'd been public about her own adoption story, tweeted to her 12 million followers, "This is every adoptive child's nightmare. Being told you should be grateful for basic human decency for not being abused for being allowed to exist. Rachel Hayes. I see you. We all see you. You deserved better." The tweet was retweeted 500,000 times in an hour. The hashtag that emerged wasn't #justice for Rachel this time. It was #we earned it, dripping with sarcasm, weaponized against Victoria and everyone like her. Memes proliferated overnight. Photos of children washing dishes with captions like, "Earning my right to food," "A kid making their bed," "Compensating my parents for their sacrifice," "A teenager doing homework," "Paying rent through good grades." The mockery was savage and unrelenting. Kenneth's response came 3 days after the press conference, and it was as cowardly as everything else he'd done. Not a personal statement, not a press conference of his own, just a brief release from his lawyer. Kenneth Hayes deeply regrets any pain caused to Rachel Hayes. The family made mistakes in their handling of certain matters. Mr. Hayes hopes for eventual reconciliation and healing. The statement landed like a deflated balloon. It was too little too late, and it directly contradicted Patricia's television interview where she'd insisted they'd done nothing wrong. The disunity was obvious, the cracks in their united front widening into chasms. Journalists immediately seized on the contradiction. "Family cannot agree on defense strategy," read one headline. "Hayes family in disarray as lawsuit intensifies," declared another. Patricia went dark. Her social media accounts, which she'd maintained carefully for years with curated photos of family dinners and inspirational quotes, suddenly went silent. Then they disappeared entirely deactivated after what must have been thousands of messages calling her out, calling her a thief, calling her worse things. I tried not to read. Victoria's professional life imploded within a week. She'd worked at a boutique PR firm in downtown Seattle, the kind of place that thrived on reputation and discretion. They released a terse statement: "Victoria Morrison is no longer employed by Sterling Communications. We wish her well in her future endeavors." Translation: they'd fired her to avoid the toxic association to keep clients from fleeing. Walter's contacts told him that Victoria's husband's family was pressuring him toward annulment. They were old Seattle money, the kind of people who valued reputation above almost everything, and being connected to this scandal was unbearable. I almost felt sorry for Victoria watching her perfect life disintegrate until I remembered her voice at the press conference, the casual cruelty with which she'd called me someone else's orphan. The social exile extended beyond the virtual world. A restaurant manager in Capitol Hill tweeted, "Recognized Patricia Hayes from the news, asked her to leave. Some people don't deserve our hospitality." The tweet went viral, inspiring others. A coffee shop owner posted a photo of Kenneth with a red circle and slash over it. "Not welcome here." Seattle's progressive community, usually big on forgiveness and second chances, had drawn a line, and the Hayes family was on the wrong side of it. But what overwhelmed me most wasn't the public condemnation of them. It was the private support for me. Thousands of emails arrived at Walter's office, so many his staff had to set up a separate system just to process them. Adoptees sharing their own stories. "My adoptive parents did this too. I thought I was the only one who felt this way. Thank you for speaking up when I couldn't." Teachers wrote, "I've seen families like yours. I've tried to help kids like you were. Thank you for exposing this." Social workers, therapists, complete strangers who just wanted me to know I wasn't alone. Someone had started a GoFundMe to help with legal expenses, which had raised over $200,000 before I even knew it existed. I had Walter contact them immediately, asking them to redirect every penny to organizations supporting abused and neglected children. I didn't need their money, but other kids like I'd been certainly did. Strangers stopped me on the street. A woman in her 60s outside a grocery store grabbed my hands and cried, telling me about the foster family who'd treated her the same way 50 years ago. A young man at a coffee shop paid for my drink and whispered, "Thank you for fighting back. You're giving the rest of us courage." A support group for adult adoptees processing complex trauma invited me to speak. I wasn't ready for that, but I attended a meeting to listen. Sitting in a circle in a community center basement, I heard stories that made mine seem almost mild. A woman whose adoptive parents had literally locked her in a basement. A man who'd been adopted specifically to care for his adoptive parents' biological child with disabilities, treated as a live-in nurse from age 7. Story after story of love, weaponized of gratitude, demanded of children, told they should be thankful for not being beaten or starved or abandoned again. Driving home that night, Dorothy squeezed my hand from the passenger seat. She'd insisted on coming despite her exhaustion, despite the pain that was becoming harder to hide. "You're becoming who you were meant to be," she said softly. "Marcus would be so proud. Not just of what you're doing to them, but of what you're going to do after. You're going to help so many children, Rachel. You're going to break cycles that have been spinning for generations." The world was on my side now. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict, and it was unanimous. But I knew the hardest part was still coming facing them in an actual courtroom under oath, where their lies couldn't hide behind carefully crafted statements and sympathetic interviewers. Where the evidence would speak and they would have to answer. And I was ready. 3 months after Walter filed the lawsuit, I walked into King County Courthouse for the first day of trial. The building was imposing, all marble columns and vaulted ceilings that echoed with footsteps and whispered conversations. Media vans lined the street outside, reporters shouting questions as Walter guided me through the crowd with a firm hand on my elbow. Inside the courtroom was packed to capacity, spectators filling every bench, more people standing along the back wall. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, Walter on my right, Dorothy on my left, despite her declining health. Across the aisle sat Kenneth, Patricia, and Victoria, with their attorney, a man named Richard Drummond, who specialized in defending the indefensible. He wore an expensive suit and a practiced expression of righteous indignation that didn't quite reach his eyes. The judge was Honorable Margaret Chen, a woman in her mid-60s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for having no patience for nonsense. She entered, we all stood, and the trial began. The first 2 days were methodical, almost tedious. Walter presented the financial evidence piece by piece, building his case with the precision of a master craftsman. Bank statements, withdrawal records, cross-referenced dates, showing that money taken for my supposed private school education coincided with my enrollment in public school. Receipts from luxury vacations charged against my trust fund while I worked after school at a library for minimum wage. Drummond tried his argument, speaking with the smooth confidence of someone who'd talked his way out of tighter corners. Your Honor, my clients used the trust fund for Rachel's living expenses, which is explicitly permitted under Washington state guardianship law. Food, shelter, clothing, these are legitimate expenses for raising a child. Walter's response was surgical. Not when the child in question is working part-time at 16 years old to buy her own school supplies, while the family uses her inheritance to fund luxury vacations to Hawaii. Not when the biological daughter receives a new car while the adopted daughter takes the bus. Not when $75,000 is withdrawn for college expenses while Rachel pays her own tuition through scholarships and student loans. Judge Chen's expression throughout these exchanges made it clear where her sympathies lay. When Drummond tried to argue that raising a child for 18 years entitled his clients to compensation from the trust fund, she'd actually raised her eyebrows and said, "Counselor, are you seriously suggesting that providing basic care to a dependent child constitutes a billable service?" But none of that prepared me for day 3. Walter stood and approached the bench with a document I'd seen before, but whose significance in this moment felt newly weighted. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit D into evidence. DNA test results. Drummond was on his feet immediately. Objection. Relevance, Your Honor. This case is about financial mismanagement, not genetic relationships. Judge Chen studied Walter for a moment. I'll allow it. Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Walter. Walter nodded to his assistant, who brought up the document on the courtroom's projection screen. I watched as the image filled the space behind the judge's bench, large enough for everyone to read clearly. St. Mary's Hospital, Seattle, Washington. DNA comparison test. Date, May 15, 2003. Subject, a Dorothy Hayes. Subject B, Rachel Hayes. Shared DNA 12.5%. Relationship determination. Consistent with grandmother-granddaughter. The courtroom erupted in whispers. I heard the journalists behind me frantically typing or scribbling notes. Patricia's face had gone completely white. Victoria looked between her parents in confusion. And Kenneth just stared at the table, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. This DNA test was performed at St. Mary's Hospital on May 15, 2003. Walter said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. 5 days after Rachel's parents died in a car accident. When Rachel was brought to the hospital for treatment of minor injuries, Dorothy Hayes arrived claiming to be the child's grandmother. Hospital protocol required proof of relationship before releasing certain medical information. The test confirmed what Dorothy already knew. Rachel Hayes is her biological granddaughter, the daughter of her son Marcus Hayes, Kenneth Hayes' younger brother. I couldn't breathe. I'd known this intellectually since the night of the wedding, since Dorothy told me in the limousine, but seeing it displayed in a courtroom, seeing it become public record, made it real in a way nothing else had. Kenneth Hayes was present when these results came back, Walter continued. He saw them with his own eyes. He knew from that moment forward that Rachel was not some distant connection or random orphan. She was his niece, his brother's daughter, his mother's granddaughter. Walter pulled out another document, this one a letter in Dorothy's handwriting. Dorothy Hayes wrote to Kenneth on May 20th, 2003, 5 days after the DNA test. I'll read the relevant portion. Let's keep Rachel's connection to me private for now. She's just lost her parents. She's traumatized and grieving. When she's 18 and more stable, we'll tell her everything about her family, her heritage, her place in our lives. Until then, let's just focus on helping her heal. My eyes found Kenneth across the courtroom. He still wouldn't look at me. Kenneth Hayes agreed to this plan, Walter said. But he didn't keep quiet to protect Rachel from stress or trauma. He kept quiet to control her inheritance. Because if people knew Rachel was Marcus Hayes' daughter, if they knew she was Dorothy Hayes' granddaughter, she would have had legal claims to family assets, to the estate, to resources he wanted to keep for himself. So he did something unconscionable. He buried her identity completely. He changed her last name to Turner through adoption, erasing the Hayes name that was her birthright. He told everyone she was just some distant connection they'd taken in out of charity. And he used that lie to justify spending her inheritance while making her feel grateful for a roof over her head. Judge Chen turned her gaze to Kenneth and her expression was withering. Mr. Hayes, you concealed your niece's true identity to defraud her of her inheritance. Drummond tried to salvage it. Your Honor, my client was attempting to protect a vulnerable child from the complications of protect himself clearly, Judge Chen interrupted. Protect his access to money that didn't belong to him. Continue, Mr. Walter. I looked across the courtroom at Kenneth, and our eyes finally met. I saw shame there and fear and something that might have been regret if it weren't so thoroughly contaminated by self-pity. This man who'd called himself my father, who'd let me believe for 22 years that I was an obligation, grudgingly accepted, a burden, charitably borne, he'd known from day one exactly who I was. I wasn't just a tool to him. I was an obstacle between him and his mother's fortune, and he'd spent 2 decades systematically trying to erase me. After the DNA revelation, the defense didn't so much crumble as disintegrate. Patricia took the stand the following morning wearing a conservative navy suit and an expression she probably thought conveyed wounded dignity. She settled into the witness chair and began her rehearsed testimony about taking me in out of kindness, about the sacrifices they'd made, about how they'd loved me like their own. Walter let her talk for exactly 3 minutes before he stood for cross-examination. Mrs. Hayes, you testified that you loved Rachel like your own daughter. Is that why you told her, and I quote, "We don't celebrate your birthday," when she turned 16? Patricia's composure flickered. I don't recall saying that exactly. You have to understand, raising a traumatized child was difficult. Walter nodded to his assistant, who pressed play on an audio file. A woman's voice filled the courtroom, tinny but clear, recounting a conversation she'd witnessed. Rachel told Patricia it was her birthday, and Patricia said, "We don't celebrate your birthday, Rachel. Victoria's birthday matters because we created her. You were just inherited." I was Rachel's friend. I was standing right there. I'll never forget it. Patricia's face flushed red. That's taken out of context. I was having a difficult day. Anyone who's raised children knows. You also testified on television that you have receipts proving all trust fund money was spent on Rachel's care. Walter continued. Where are those receipts? We have them somewhere. Years of documents, it's hard to. You don't have them because they don't exist, Walter said flatly. Because you spent Rachel's money on your biological daughter's car, on cosmetic surgery for yourself, on vacations. Rachel wasn't even invited to attend. Patricia changed her story 3 times in the next 10 minutes, contradicting her television interview, contradicting her earlier testimony, tying herself in knots, trying to explain the unexplainable. By the time Walter finished with her, she was crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage at being caught. Victoria was even worse. Her lawyer, clearly recognizing a disaster when he saw one, advised her to invoke her Fifth Amendment right when asked about the wedding toast, about the press conference meltdown, about calling me someone else's orphan. Victoria sat mute in the witness box, refusing to answer question after question, while the jury watched with barely concealed disgust. Kenneth's lawyer made one last desperate attempt, arguing that his client had been under Patricia's psychological control, that he was a victim himself, manipulated and dominated. It was pathetic watching a grown man try to dodge responsibility by claiming his wife made him do it, especially when the evidence showed 22 years of active participation in the fraud. The trial lasted a week. On the final day, Judge Chen delivered her ruling with the kind of precision that comes from decades on the bench. Kenneth Hayes and Patricia Hayes must repay the $750,000 stolen from Rachel Hayes' trust fund, plus $1,350,000 in interest and compensatory damages, for a total of $2.1 million. She paused, looking directly at the defendants. Additionally, I'm awarding $3 million in punitive damages for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Total judgment, $5.1 million. Patricia actually gasped. They didn't have that kind of money. This would bankrupt them completely. But Judge Chen wasn't finished. The district attorney has been monitoring this case. Embezzlement of a minor's trust fund is a criminal offense. Kenneth Hayes, you face potential criminal charges carrying a sentence of 5 to 10 years in state prison. Kenneth's face went gray. I'd been expecting this moment, had known it was coming, but actually hearing the words made my stomach clench. That's when I did something nobody expected. I'd submitted a letter to the judge that morning requesting leniency for Kenneth alone. Not for Patricia, who'd orchestrated everything. Not for Victoria, who'd learned cruelty at her mother's knee. But for Kenneth, because Dorothy had taught me something important. Justice isn't about revenge. Judge Chen referenced my letter as she considered sentencing. Ms. Hayes has submitted a request for leniency that I find remarkable given the circumstances. She writes, Kenneth is weak, not evil. He was manipulated by his wife and he failed his brother's memory. But I believe people can change. I ask the court to consider a suspended sentence with community service. The judge looked at me. Ms. Hayes, after everything they did to you, you're asking for mercy. I stood, my voice steady. My grandmother taught me that justice isn't about destruction. It's about accountability and giving people a chance at redemption. I'm not asking you to excuse what he did. I'm asking for a chance to see if he can become the man my father might have hoped his brother could be. Judge Chen studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Kenneth Hayes, I'm sentencing you to 3 years in state prison sentence, suspended contingent upon your completion of 1,000 hours of community service and 5 years of probation. If you violate the terms of your probation in any way, you will serve the full sentence. Do you understand? Kenneth nodded, unable to speak. Patricia Hayes, you were the architect of this fraud. You showed no remorse, only anger at being caught. I'm sentencing you to 2 years in prison, not suspended, beginning immediately. You are also permanently barred from serving as a guardian or trustee for any minor. Patricia's lawyer began objecting, but Judge Chen silenced him with a look. Victoria Morrison, you didn't directly access the trust fund, so you face no criminal charges. However, you are jointly liable for the civil judgment, and I'm ordering you to undergo court-supervised family therapy for a minimum of 2 years. The judge turned back to Kenneth. Mr. Hayes, your niece just saved you from prison. I suggest you spend the rest of your life proving she wasn't wrong about you. Kenneth looked at me for the first time in weeks, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't respond. Couldn't respond. I just looked away, feeling Dorothy's hand squeeze mine from where she sat beside me in her wheelchair. She'd insisted on being present despite the pain, despite her doctor's protests. You're stronger than all of them, Dorothy whispered as the bailiff led Patricia away in handcuffs. That's why you won. But as we left the courtroom, Dorothy leaning heavily on my arm, I knew the truth. I hadn't won money that day. I'd won something more valuable: my name, my history, and the knowledge that I'd broken a cycle of abuse that might have continued for generations. The cost was about to come due, though. Dorothy was fading faster than either of us wanted to admit. 2 weeks after the trial ended, Dorothy's doctors told me she had days left, maybe a week if we were lucky. She'd refused hospitalization, insisting she wanted to die in her own home in the bedroom where she'd slept for 40 years, looking out at Lake Washington one last time. I moved into the room next to hers, sleeping in fits and starts, waking at every sound, terrified I'd miss her final moments. The hospice nurse came twice daily, adjusting Dorothy's medications, checking her vitals, speaking in that practiced, gentle tone that somehow made everything worse. Between visits, it was just Dorothy and me. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her lucid moments becoming shorter and farther apart. But when she was present, she talked. She told me about Marcus, about the son I barely remembered. "He was gentle," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Artistic. He painted watercolors. Did you know that? Terrible at it, actually, but he loved it anyway. He met your mother in a college art class. She was the talented one, and he'd sit there making muddy messes on canvas just to be near her." I held her hand, memorizing every word, desperate to collect these pieces of my father I'd been denied for so long. "You have his eyes," Dorothy continued. "The exact shade of brown with those gold flecks when the light hits them right. And his kindness. That gentle heart that made him terrible at business and wonderful at being human." "Why didn't you take me in yourself?" I asked one afternoon when she seemed particularly alert. "In 2003, after the accident. You could have raised me." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "I was 60 years old, sweetheart, grieving the loss of my youngest son. And Kenneth came to me with such conviction, such promises. He said he wanted to honor Marcus's memory by raising you, by giving you the family Marcus would have wanted for you. I believed him." She paused, struggling for breath. "By the time I realized what they were really doing, you were already so attached to them, already so damaged by their manipulation. I thought if I intervened directly, if I tried to take you away, it would traumatize you even more. So I watched, documented, waited for the moment you'd be strong enough to hear the truth. I was wrong to wait so long. I'm so sorry." "You saved me," I said firmly. "That's all that matters." The next day, Dorothy asked for Walter. She could barely speak above a whisper, but when he arrived with his briefcase, she managed to tell him to bring the blue folder. Walter retrieved it from her desk, his expression solemn as he handed it to her. Dorothy's hands shook as she opened it. Inside were the life insurance documents I'd seen before, the proof that my father had left me $1 million that had grown to $5.6 million over 22 years. But there was another document clipped to them, one I hadn't seen. 1 week before the trial, Dorothy whispered, "I transferred the entire trust into your name, irrevocably. It's yours now, Rachel. They can never touch it, no matter what happens to my estate." I started to thank her, but she wasn't finished. Walter pulled out another document, and I saw a number that made my vision blur: $15.6 million. "I added $10 million of my own money," Dorothy said. "That's separate from the estate. Use it to start the foundation we talked about." "Foundation?" I asked, though I thought I knew what she meant. "For kids like you, sweetheart. Abused adoptees, foster children, anyone who's been told they're not worth loving. Build them a place that proves otherwise. Give them what you should have had: protection, advocacy, someone who sees them." She coughed, and I could hear the rattle in her chest. "I can't do this without you," I said, crying openly now. "Yes, you can," Dorothy said with the last of her strength. "That's the whole point. You're strong enough now. You're ready." That night, I dozed fitfully in the chair beside her bed, jolting awake at every change in her breathing. At 3 in the morning, her voice cut through my uneasy sleep. Sweetheart. I was instantly alert, leaning close to her. I'm here. I'm right here. I need to tell you something important. She said, her eyes clear for the first time in days. You were never a burden. You were never unwanted. You were always loved by your parents, by Marcus, by me. And now, most importantly, by yourself. Promise me you'll remember that. I promise, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Good. Dorothy smiled, and in that moment she looked almost peaceful. Then I can go. Her eyes closed. I watched her chest rise and fall, each breath coming slower than the last. I held her hand, feeling her pulse flutter beneath my fingers like a bird's wings. Thank you for seeing me, I whispered. Thank you for fighting for me. Thank you for teaching me that I was worth fighting for. At 3:47 in the morning, Dorothy Hayes took her last breath. I sat in the silence that followed, feeling the weight of her loss and her legacy pressing down on me in equal measure. On the nightstand, I noticed an envelope I hadn't seen before, my name written across it in Dorothy's elegant script. Walter must have left it earlier following her final instructions. My hands shook as I opened it. The letter was 3 pages handwritten, her penmanship growing shakier toward the end as the illness progressed. She wrote about her life, about loving Marcus and Kenneth despite their differences, about the mistakes she'd made and the things she'd learned. She wrote about the foundation she hoped I'd build, about the children I could help, about breaking cycles of abuse that had spun through generations. The last lines made me sob into my hands. The $8 billion was never the real inheritance, Rachel. You are. You're the proof that love can triumph over cruelty, that kindness can survive in the harshest conditions, that one person choosing to break a cycle can change countless lives. Don't just spend the money. Become it. Live it. Pass it on. She left me an empire. But more than that, she left me a mission to take the pain they inflicted and transform it into protection for others. I didn't know if I was strong enough, but I knew I had to try, because she'd believed I could. 3 months after Dorothy's death, I woke up every morning in her house, feeling like I was drowning in silence and money. The estate had been transferred with the efficiency only ironclad legal documents can provide, making me, at 27 years old, one of the wealthiest women in Washington. My bank account had numbers I couldn't fully comprehend. I owned properties I'd never visited, and I felt completely, utterly lost. Dorothy's memorial service was held on a gray Seattle morning, rain misting down in that persistent way that feels less like weather and more like the city's mood. I'd expected a small gathering, maybe a few dozen people who'd known her in her final years. Instead, hundreds filled the church. Former employees who spoke about her fairness, scholarship recipients she'd funded anonymously, families who'd received help from her quiet philanthropy that never sought recognition or tax deductions. Person after person stood to tell stories about Dorothy's impact, and I realized I'd only known one facet of this woman who'd saved me. Sitting in the front pew listening to these testimonies, something shifted inside me. I had $8 billion, and nothing to do with it except let it accumulate interest. Dorothy had shown me what wealth could do when it had purpose. She'd built something that lasted beyond her lifetime, touched lives that would never know her name, and she'd charged me with continuing that work. I called Walter the next day. Within a week, we were sitting in a conference room with nonprofit consultants, estate planners, and legal specialists. I told them what I wanted: a foundation that would provide what I'd needed but never received. Legal representation for children trapped in abusive, adoptive, or foster situations. Therapy from professionals who understood complex trauma. Educational scholarships that didn't require perfect grades or essays about gratitude. Emergency housing for kids who needed to be removed from dangerous homes immediately. The Dorothy Hayes Foundation for Abused Adoptees. I said and heard my voice crack on her name. We spent 6 weeks developing the infrastructure, filing paperwork, building a team. I interviewed therapists and lawyers and social workers, looking for people who understood that sometimes the family that's supposed to protect you is the one you most need protecting from. Our first case came through a referral from Child Protective Services in Tacoma. A 14-year-old girl named Emma removed from a foster home where she'd been used as unpaid household labor while the foster parents collected her stipend. The parallels to my own story were so obvious they hurt. Emma did all the cooking, cleaning, and yard work while the biological children played and studied. When a teacher noticed Emma falling asleep in class and reported it, an investigation revealed she was working until midnight most nights to complete her chores. I attended the emergency hearing where the foundation's lawyer argued for her removal. I watched Emma sit small and hunched in clothes that didn't fit properly, and I saw myself at that age. After the judge granted removal and placement with a vetted family the foundation had identified, I met with Emma privately. She looked at me with exhausted, suspicious eyes. "Why are you helping me? What do you want?" "Nothing," I said. "Someone helped me when I couldn't help myself. Now I'm passing it forward." "Did you have a family like mine?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "And I survived it. You will too." Over the first year, we helped 47 children. Each case file crossed my desk and I read every single one. I attended court hearings when I could watch as kids were moved from places that hurt them to places that might help them heal. I wrote personal notes to each child, not from some wealthy benefactor they'd never meet, but from someone who understood exactly what they'd endured. The work was exhausting. Some nights I came home and cried from the weight of so many broken childhoods, so much preventable damage. But it was also healing in ways I hadn't expected. Every child we helped felt like a younger version of myself being saved given the intervention I desperately needed. Through the foundation, I found something I'd been searching for my entire life: real family. Not the kind determined by blood or legal documents, but the kind built through shared purpose. Melissa, our lead trauma therapist, was a woman in her 50s who'd spent decades working with abused children. She took me under her wing, teaching me about healing, about the long journey from victim to survivor to someone who could help others survive. We'd have coffee every Tuesday morning, and she became the mother figure I'd never had. The legal team, the social workers, the administrative staff, we became a chosen family bound together by our mission to break cycles of abuse. We celebrated wins together and mourned losses. We showed up for each other in ways my adoptive family never had. I also started attending a support group for adult adoptees processing complex trauma. Sitting in that circle of people who understood what it meant to be told you should be grateful for basic human decency, I finally understood what Dorothy had meant when she said family isn't who you're born to, it's who stands beside you. These people, virtual strangers when we met, saw my pain and reflected it back with recognition and validation. They stood beside me as I learned to stand beside myself. I was learning to measure wealth not in dollars, but in lives changed. 47 children in 1 year. 47 futures redirected from potential disaster toward possibility. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was something real, something Dorothy would have been proud of. But late at night, when the foundation work was done and the house was quiet, I'd sometimes get calls from blocked numbers, hang-ups that felt pointed rather than random. Letters would arrive with no return address, and I'd remember that my old family wasn't done with me yet. They were desperate, dangerous, and circling closer. 18 months after the trial, the letters started arriving. The first came from Kenneth, written on lined notebook paper in handwriting that looked shakier than I remembered. The scandal had made him unemployable in Seattle's tight-knit legal and business community. The house had been foreclosed to pay a fraction of what they owed me. He was living in a studio apartment in Renton, working odd jobs under the table. "Rachel," the letter began, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I failed you in every way a father figure could fail. But I'm writing to ask you to consider helping Victoria. Her marriage fell apart. She has no income, no prospects. I'm asking not for me, but for her. Could you find it in your heart to help her get back on her feet? Just a small loan to cover rent while she looks for work." I read it once, then filed it away without responding. Kenneth had spent 22 years teaching me that my needs didn't matter. Now he expected me to prioritize Victoria's comfort over my own boundaries. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived, this one from Patricia. The return address was Cedar Creek Correctional Facility, the minimum security women's prison, where she was serving her sentence. Dear Rachel, it began, her handwriting still precise despite the cheap prison-issue pen. I've had a great deal of time to reflect on my mistakes. I was a flawed mother, but I need you to understand that I did love you in my way. Raising you wasn't easy, but I did my best with the tools I had. When I'm released in 8 months, I'll have nothing. No home, no job, very little family support. I'm asking for mercy, just a temporary place to stay while I rebuild my life. Surely you can afford to help the woman who raised you. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Patricia hadn't spent 18 months reflecting on her cruelty. She'd spent it calculating her next move, figuring out how to extract resources from the person she'd spent decades exploiting. I filed her letter next to Kenneth's. Then came the email from Victoria's subject line in all caps. Emergency. Please read. I almost deleted it without opening. But something made me click maybe morbid curiosity about what desperate angle she'd try next. Rachel, the email began. I know I hurt you. I know I was horrible at the wedding and during the trial. I've been in therapy working on myself, trying to understand why I treated you the way I did. But right now, I need help desperately. I'm pregnant. My ex-husband wants nothing to do with me or the baby. I have no health insurance, no way to pay for prenatal care. I'm terrified and alone. I know I don't deserve your help, but this baby is innocent. Please, for your niece or nephew, could you help me? I need housing, medical care, just basic support until I can get back on my feet. For a moment, I felt it, that old familiar tug of sympathy, the ingrained response to prioritize others' needs over my own pain. An innocent baby shouldn't suffer because of Victoria's mistakes. Maybe this was her rock bottom, the crisis that would finally make her change. Then I remembered Dorothy's voice. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. I forwarded the email to a private investigator I'd put on retainer, a woman named Sarah who'd done excellent work tracking down information for some of the Foundation's cases. Can you verify this quietly? Sarah called me 5 days later. She's not pregnant, Rachel. I have medical records showing she had her tubes tied 2 years ago after her marriage started falling apart. She told 3 former friends the same story in the past 6 months, collected between 5,000 and 10,000 from each, then blocked them when they started asking questions. I also have photos from last week showing her drinking at a bar in Belltown. The betrayal shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Even after everything, some part of me had hoped Victoria might be capable of genuine change, genuine need. I sat down and composed a response, taking my time to make sure every word was precise. Victoria, I know you're not pregnant. I have medical records proving you've been surgically sterilized for 2 years. I also have evidence that you used this same scam on 3 other people recently, defrauding them of thousands of dollars. You have 48 hours to do 3 things. Return every dollar you stole from your friends. Issue public apologies to each of them. Enroll in a legitimate job training program which I will fund. If you do these things, I'll help you rebuild your life with dignity, therapy, education, job placement, support, all of it. Refuse and I turn all evidence of your fraud over to the Seattle Police Department. Your choice. My phone rang 30 minutes later, Victoria's name flashing on the screen. I answered. You're bluffing, she screamed, her voice shrill with panic. You wouldn't actually call the police on your own sister. Try me. I said calmly and hung up. I gave her exactly 48 hours. When the deadline passed with no response, I sent everything to the police medical records, bank statements from the friends she'd scammed, screenshots of her contradictory stories, photos of her drinking while supposedly pregnant and desperate. Victoria was arrested 3 days later. The charges were misdemeanor fraud, nothing that would put her in prison for long, but the public humiliation was severe. Her mugshot appeared in the local news. Social media, which had already destroyed her once, piled on again. Walter called after seeing the news. You gave her every chance to do the right thing. I gave her a chance at redemption, I said. She chose to keep lying. That's on her, not me. Dorothy would be proud, Walter said. Mercy with boundaries. That's the hardest kind to practice. I thought about that conversation for days afterward. I'd spent my childhood learning that mercy meant accepting abuse, that forgiveness meant letting people hurt you repeatedly, that love required sacrificing your own well-being. Dorothy had taught me something different, that mercy could coexist with boundaries, that offering help didn't mean accepting manipulation, that you could care about someone's well-being without letting them destroy yours. I learned that mercy isn't weakness. It's offering a hand up a genuine path toward change and dignity. But when that hand is slapped away when someone chooses to keep falling because they think you'll always catch them, you let them fall. Victoria chose the fall. And I was done trying to catch people who wanted to drag me down with them. Patricia was released from prison after serving 18 months, and I learned about it not from her, but from a brief mention in a local news article about prison overcrowding. She was 62 years old, had a felony record, and according to the article, no permanent address upon release. I imagined her walking out of Cedar Creek Correctional with a plastic bag of belongings and nowhere to go. She tried to move back in with Kenneth, but he was living in a one-bedroom apartment in Renton that barely had space for him, let alone a second person. He was surviving on odd jobs, paid under the table. His legal career destroyed his reputation in ruins. There was no room for Patricia there physically or otherwise. I heard through Walter's network that she'd reached out to her old friends from the country club days, the women she'd lunched with and gossiped with for decades. They all ghosted her. Not a single returned call, not one offer of help or even acknowledgement. Patricia ended up in a subsidized senior apartment complex in South Seattle, the kind of place she would have driven past without a second glance in her former life. She found part-time work at a grocery store, bagging purchases for customers who might once have been her peers. A local paper did one of those "Where Are They Now" pieces about notable local scandals. The photo showed Patricia in a store uniform, her hair grayer than I remembered her face, harder standing behind a register with a forced smile that looked more like a grimace. The caption identified her simply as Patricia Hayes, convicted of embezzlement, now working retail. The humiliation must have been profound for someone who'd once organized charity galas and looked down on people who worked service jobs. She wrote me one final letter, brief and to the point. "I don't ask for money. I don't ask for help. I ask only for forgiveness." I read it once and put it away without responding. Patricia would spend whatever years she had left in obscurity, a cautionary tale about what happens when cruelty finally catches up with you. Victoria's trajectory was even more dramatic. After the fraud arrest, her ex-husband's family pushed hard for an annulment, and a judge granted it based on fraudulent misrepresentation during the marriage. Victoria fought it, but she had no credibility left, no resources to mount a real defense. Her name had become internet poison, permanently attached to videos of her wedding cruelty and her press conference meltdown. She tried what some consultant probably told her was social media rehabilitation, posting carefully crafted apologies and vague statements about working on herself. But the internet has a long memory and no forgiveness for performative redemption. Every post was flooded with comments reminding her of what she'd said, what she'd done, who she really was. Eventually, Victoria disappeared from Seattle entirely. I heard she'd moved to Arizona, trying to start over somewhere no one knew her story. 2 years later, a journalist tracking down the "Where Are They Now" angle found her working at a call center in Phoenix under her middle name. Victoria refused the interview, but the journalist got a photo anyway, a woman who looked 10 years older than she should, wearing a headset in a cubicle farm, her face gaunt and tired. I saw the article online and felt something strange and hollow in my chest. Not satisfaction, not pity, just a deep, exhausted sadness that it had come to this. I called Melissa that evening, needing to process what I was feeling. "I thought I'd feel happy seeing her hit bottom," I admitted. "Some part of me wanted her to suffer the way she made me suffer, but I don't feel happy, I just feel tired." "That's growth," Melissa said gently. "You're letting go of the need for her to suffer. You're releasing the emotional investment you had in her destruction. That's healthy, Rachel. That's healing. Kenneth fell furthest perhaps because he'd had the most potential for redemption and squandered it slowly. After his suspended sentence, he'd started strong with his community service requirement, showing up to the homeless shelter where he'd been assigned his 1,000 hours. But depression set in, that paralyzing shame that makes every day feel impossible. He started missing shifts, then missed a meeting with his probation officer. Walter told me Kenneth had come within hours of being sent to prison before his probation officer gave him one final chance. Now he was living alone in that small apartment, estranged from Patricia, who blamed him for being too weak to stand up to his mother, estranged from Victoria, who blamed him for not protecting her from Dorothy's manipulation. He'd lost his wife, his daughter, his mother, his career, his home, and very nearly his freedom. The letter he sent me was different from the others. It didn't ask for money or help or even a response. It was written on plain paper and handwriting that looked like it had taken multiple attempts to get the words right. "Rachel," it began, "I don't expect you to read this, much less respond, but I need to say these things whether you hear them or not. I see now what I did. I destroyed my brother's daughter because I was jealous that my mother loved Marcus more than me. Even after he died, I was competing with a ghost, and you paid the price for my envy. I took your inheritance. I let Patricia abuse you. I erased your identity, all because some sick part of me wanted to prove I deserved what Marcus had. I failed him. I failed you. And I spent 22 years failing the child you were and the woman you became. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to know I see it now. I understand what I did, and I'm trying to be better. I'll probably fail at that too, but I have to try." I read that letter 3 times, looking for the manipulation, the angle, the hidden ask. But unlike Kenneth's other communications, unlike Patricia's self-serving justifications, and Victoria's fraudulent emergencies, this rang true. There was no plea for help, no attempt to minimize his responsibility, just raw acknowledgement of what he'd done and why. They'd all fallen. Patricia into bitterness and obscurity, Victoria into denial and exile, Kenneth into despair and isolation. I'd won the lawsuit, exposed their fraud, taken back what they'd stolen. Justice had been served. The scales had been balanced. So why did it feel like everyone had lost? Maybe because revenge was never the point. Justice was. And justice doesn't always feel good. It doesn't give you that clean sense of satisfaction you expect. It just feels necessary, like setting a broken bone. It hurts, but it's what needs to happen for healing to begin. 2 years after the trial, the Dorothy Hayes Foundation had grown into something that would have made its namesake proud. We'd moved into a renovated building in Capitol Hill, employed 15 full-time staff, and helped over 100 children escape situations that echoed my own. I was in my office reviewing case files when Sarah, our receptionist, buzzed in with an unusual note of tension in her voice. "Rachel, there's someone here to see you. Kenneth Hayes. He says he doesn't want money. He wants to volunteer." My first instinct was to refuse without even seeing him. The audacity of showing up at a foundation built to help abused children when he'd enabled my abuse for 22 years felt almost obscene. But curiosity won out over anger, or maybe it was something Dorothy had said once about giving people rope to either climb or hang themselves. "Put him in the conference room, call Walter and ask him to come over." 20 minutes later, I walked into the conference room with Walter beside me. Kenneth sat at the long table and I barely recognized him. He'd aged dramatically in 2 years, his hair completely gray, now wearing clothes that were clean but worn thin. His hands shook slightly as they rested on the table. "Thank you for seeing me," he said quietly. "I know I have no right to be here." "Then why are you?" I asked, not bothering to soften my tone. Kenneth took a breath. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm here to offer something, my time. I've been doing community service at a homeless shelter working with at-risk kids and teenagers. It's the first time in my life I've felt like I was actually helping instead of just taking. I know what you're building here. I know I'm probably the last person who deserves to be part of it. But I'm asking for a chance to do one thing right in my life." Part of me wanted to throw him out immediately, How dare he think he could waltz into the foundation built on the ruins of what he'd destroyed and ask to work with vulnerable children? But another part heard Dorothy's voice in my head. People can change if they want to badly enough. The question is, do you believe he wants to leave the room? I said. Wait in the lobby. After he left, I turned to Walter and pulled out my phone to call Melissa, putting her on speaker. Legally, you can refuse him, Walter said. You have every right to keep him away from this foundation and these kids. Morally, that's your call, Rachel. Melissa's voice came through the phone measured and thoughtful. As a therapist, I can tell you that what you're describing sounds like genuine remorse. But genuine remorse doesn't erase harm. You don't owe him redemption. The question is whether you believe he's changed enough to be safe around these kids. I want to see proof, I said. Documentation of his community service, references from the shelter. I need to know this isn't another manipulation. Kenneth provided everything. His community service logs showed 800 hours completed, 200 more than his sentence required, and he was still showing up weekly despite having fulfilled his obligation. The shelter supervisor's testimonial was glowing. Kenneth is patient, never judgmental, shows up on time every week. The teenagers respond to him. He's become an asset to our program. I spent 3 days thinking about it, barely sleeping, weighing Dorothy's lessons about redemption against my own hard-won understanding that some people don't deserve second chances. Finally, I called Kenneth back to the office. I'll let you volunteer, I said, watching his face carefully. But there are conditions. You'll be supervised at all times. You'll work with teenage boys in the program, kids who've had absent or abusive father figures. And if you lie to me even once, if you manipulate anyone, if you do anything that makes me question this decision, you're gone forever. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because these kids deserve every good person we can find. Prove you're one of them. Tears streamed down Kenneth's face. Thank you. I won't let you down. Over the next 6 months, I watched him carefully looking for signs of the man who'd buried my identity and spent my inheritance. Instead, I saw someone different emerge. Kenneth led a weekly support group for teenage boys, many of whom had fathers who'd abandoned them or abused them or simply failed them in quieter ways. He shared his own story with my permission, talked about his failures, his jealousy, his cowardice. He became a living example that accountability was possible. The kids responded to him in ways I hadn't expected. One afternoon, a 15-year-old named Marcus, which felt like some kind of cosmic joke or blessing, came to my office. Ms. Hayes, I just wanted to say thank you for letting Mr. Kenneth work here, he said. He told me something last week that I can't stop thinking about. He said being a man means owning your mistakes, not running from them. I've never heard anyone say that before. My dad just left. He didn't own anything. I watched Kenneth through the glass wall of my office, saw him sitting with a group of boys listening with attention that looked genuine. He'd aged into someone I didn't recognize, and maybe that was the point. Maybe redemption required becoming someone new. I gave Kenneth what no one ever gave me growing up, a second chance. Not because he deserved it, but because I wanted to prove that the cycle could be broken. That hurt people don't have to hurt people. That redemption is possible if you're willing to work for it every single day. 3 years after Dorothy's death, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, a 9-year-old girl named Sophie arrived at the Foundation's residential program. Her case file read like a modern horror story adopted at age 3 by a couple who'd seemed perfect during the screening process, then used her as content for their family influencer brand. Thousands of followers watched carefully curated videos of their perfect blended family, while behind the camera, Sophie was emotionally starved and physically disciplined for not performing happiness on command. A teacher had noticed bruises and made the call that saved her. I met Sophie during intake, which I didn't usually attend anymore, but something about her case file had pulled at me, and I'd asked to be present. She was tiny for 9, with dark hair and eyes that looked too old for her face. She wouldn't make eye contact, just stared at her shoes while the social worker explained the program. I knelt down to her level. "Hi, Sophie. I'm Rachel. You're safe here. No one will hurt you anymore." She looked at me then, just for a second, and whispered, "Do I have to be grateful?" My heart shattered. This child had been taught the same lesson I'd learned, that safety was a privilege requiring constant thankfulness rather than a basic right. "No, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick. "You never have to be grateful for basic safety. That's a right, not a favor." I didn't usually get personally involved with the kids in our program. Melissa had helped me establish professional boundaries, had explained that I couldn't save every child by myself, that the foundation's strength was in its systems and staff. But Sophie was different. The parallels to my own story were impossible to ignore. A child used as a prop, taught to perform gratitude, punished for failing to be what others needed her to be. I started visiting during her art therapy sessions. The therapist mentioned Sophie loved to draw, and I remembered the picture Patricia had torn up when I was 7. I brought Sophie a full set of art supplies, professional grade-colored pencils, and thick sketch paper, and watched her face light up in a way I suspected it rarely had. One afternoon, Sophie showed me a drawing she'd finished: 2 women holding hands, one tall with dark hair, one shorter with silver hair. Both were smiling. "Who are they?" I asked gently. Sophie looked up at me with those 2 old eyes. "It's you and Grandma Dorothy. I read about her in the brochure in the common room. I wish I had a grandma like that." I had to blink back tears. "You know what you do now? Not by blood, but by choice." Over the following months, I taught Sophie to play piano, sitting beside her on the bench in the Foundation's music room. Dorothy had taught me the same way in secret visits Patricia had always cut short. Now I taught Sophie the same simple melodies, watched her small fingers find the keys. Saw her smile when she got a song right. We started a ritual: ice cream Fridays. Every Friday after school, I'd pick Sophie up and we'd go to the ice cream shop near the Foundation. I'd order mint chocolate chip, she'd get strawberry, and I'd ask the question Dorothy used to ask me, "How was your week, sweetheart?" Sophie would tell me about school, about the other kids in the program, about the things she was learning and feeling. And I would listen the way Dorothy had listened to me, like every word mattered, like her experiences were valid and important. 6 months into our relationship, Sophie asked me a question that changed everything. "Miss Rachel, can I call you?" "Auntie?" I couldn't speak for a moment. This child wanted me permanently in her life, wanted to claim me as family. I talked to the Foundation's board, to Sophie's social worker, to Melissa. Sophie didn't need formal adoption. She was thriving in the residential program with peer support and professional care. But she needed what I'd needed: one person who would be there unconditionally, who would choose her again and again. We created a legal guardianship through the Foundation's Forever Family program, connecting children with adult mentors for life. At the small ceremony making it official with the board and Sophie's care team present, Sophie threw her arms around me. "I love you, Auntie Rachel." I held her tight, this child who'd been used and discarded, who'd learned all the wrong lessons about love and worth. "I love you too, sweetheart." Later, standing in my office, I looked at the drawing Sophie had made, now framed and hanging beside my desk. 2 women holding hands, choosing each other, building family from intention rather than obligation. This was what Dorothy had meant when she said, "Pass it on." The money, the foundation, the legal victories, those were just tools. This was the real legacy: breaking cycles, choosing love, proving to one child at a time that they mattered. I couldn't save my own childhood, but I was saving Sophie's. And in doing that, I finally saved something in myself that had been broken for 27 years. I became the person I'd needed when I was 9 years old. And in saving Sophie, I finally saved myself. The little girl inside me who'd been told she didn't matter, she was watching me prove that she did. 5 years after the trial, I opened my email one morning to find a message from a Forbes magazine editor requesting an interview for their annual philanthropy issue. The Dorothy Hayes Foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined: 3 residential centers across Washington, Oregon, and California, serving over 200 children annually with a staff of 45, and a budget that had reached $50 million. The story, they said, was too compelling not to tell. The cover photo shoot felt surreal. They wanted me standing in front of the main Dorothy Hayes Center with some of the kids from the program. Sophie stood beside me, now 14 and thriving, along with a dozen other children whose lives had intersected with mine through the foundation's work. The photographer kept asking me to smile more naturally, and finally Sophie whispered, "Just think about Ice Cream Friday," which made me laugh genuinely enough that they got their shot. The article's headline read, "From Orphan to Empire, How Rachel Hayes Built a $50 million Foundation and Saved Hundreds of Lives." They'd done their research thoroughly, detailing the abuse, the wedding humiliation, the trial, Dorothy's deathbed charge. But the focus was on what came after, on transformation rather than trauma. They quoted me saying something I'd told the reporter during our interview. "Wealth isn't measured in what you keep. It's measured in what you give that keeps giving." The response was overwhelming. The story went viral within hours, but this time the narrative wasn't about my victimhood or the family's cruelty. It was about hope, about systems change, about what's possible when pain gets transformed into purpose. NPR called for an interview. Good Morning America wanted me on their show. A TED Talk invitation arrived asking me to speak about breaking cycles of abuse. I hated the attention, the way strangers now recognized me in grocery stores, the constant requests for my time and story. But Melissa helped me reframe it. Every interview was a chance to advocate for adoptee rights, to push for foster care reform, to educate people about trauma-informed care. The platform felt like a responsibility Dorothy had prepared me for, even if I'd never wanted it. It was during this media surge that Victoria reached out, not directly, but through Jennifer, someone we'd both known in high school who I'd reconnected with through the foundation's fundraising network. Jennifer called me with obvious discomfort in her voice. "Rachel, I know this is weird, but Victoria asked me to contact you. She wants to meet. Says she has something important to tell you, that she wants to apologize face to face." Everyone advised me to refuse. Walter said it was likely another manipulation. Melissa worried about my emotional safety. Sophie, with the wisdom of a 14-year-old who'd learned to read people's intentions for survival, said simply, "You don't owe her anything." But some part of me needed to know if Victoria was capable of genuine change, or if she'd remain frozen in the cruelty I remembered. I agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop in Fremont, with Foundation security sitting at a nearby table. Victoria arrived 10 minutes late, and I barely recognized her. She'd aged in ways that went beyond years. Her face harder and thinner, her clothes expensive but worn at the edges. She sat down across from me without ordering anything. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I replied. "Say what you came to say." Victoria took a breath. "I've spent 5 years thinking about what I did to you. I was cruel. I was raised to be cruel, but that's not an excuse. I'm in therapy now, actually doing the work instead of just performing recovery for social media. I'm trying to understand why I treated you the way I did, why I needed to hurt you to feel powerful." She paused. "I'm not asking to be in your life. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, and that I'm proud of what you've built, even though I have no right to be." I studied her face, looking for the performance, the angle. Part of me wanted to believe this was real growth. But I'd learned from Dorothy that believing someone had changed and trusting them were two different things. "Victoria, I appreciate that you're in therapy. I genuinely hope you find peace." I kept my voice level. "But I need you to understand something. We're not sisters. We never were. You were a person I lived with who hurt me repeatedly, systematically for 22 years. Apologizing now doesn't undo that damage." Her face fell, hope draining from her expression. "So you'll never forgive me?" "Forgiveness isn't something you get to demand," I said. "It's something I might choose for myself in my own time as a way to let go of anger. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. I don't trust you, Victoria. I don't want you in my life, and that's my right." I stood to leave, then turned back. Family isn't who shares your blood or your childhood home. Family is who stands beside you, not above you. You spent your whole life standing on top of me, using me as a stepping stone to make yourself feel elevated. I'm not giving you another chance to do that." I walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, heard Victoria crying behind me, but didn't turn around. Outside, the autumn air felt crisp and clean, and I realized I felt nothing. Not satisfaction at her tears, not guilt for refusing her olive branch, just a calm certainty that I'd made the right choice. 6 years after the trial, a phone call interrupted my morning coffee. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar Oregon number, and I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. "Ms. Hayes, this is Caroline Miller, a social worker at Riverside Hospice in Bend, Oregon. I'm calling about Patricia Hayes. She's in our care and she's asked us to contact you." My hand tightened around the phone. "What does she want?" "She has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors give her 2 to 3 weeks. She's written you a letter and wants to know if you'll visit." The same cancer that had killed Dorothy. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. "She's not my mother," I said flatly. "And no, I won't visit." I hung up before the social worker could respond. But 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived via certified mail forwarded by the hospice. I stared at it for a week, moving it from my kitchen counter to my desk to the drawer where I kept things I didn't know what to do with. Finally, late one night when I couldn't sleep, I opened it. 8 pages handwritten in script that grew shakier as it progressed. Patricia's handwriting unmistakable, even weakened by illness. "Rachel," it began, "I don't expect you to read this. I don't deserve that courtesy. But I'm dying, and I need to tell the truth before I go." She wrote about her own childhood, about a mother who'd measured love and achievement and withheld affection as punishment. "I was told I was worthless unless I was perfect. So I became someone who could only feel powerful by controlling others, by making someone else feel as small as I'd felt. When Kenneth brought you home, I saw myself in you." She continued, her handwriting becoming harder to read. "A little girl who'd lost everything, who was scared and grieving. And I hated you for it. Because you remained kind despite your pain, and I'd become cruel because of mine. Your resilience was a mirror showing me everything I'd failed to be." She confessed to specific cruelties with a clarity that suggested she'd been thinking about them for years. "The day I tore up your drawing, it wasn't about the drawing. It was because watching you grieve openly reminded me I'd never been allowed to grieve anything. The birthday comment wasn't about you. My mother used to forget my birthday, would tell me I wasn't special enough to celebrate. I gave you the same wound she gave me." The letter's final page was almost illegible. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to visit. I just need you to know you were never the problem. I was. You were a beautiful child who deserved love, and I failed you because I was too broken to give it. If there's a heaven, I'll spend eternity apologizing to your parents. If there's hell, I'll spend it wishing I'd been brave enough to love you." I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of reconciliation or forgiveness, but tears for the waste of it all, for the cycles of pain that spiraled through generations. I called Kenneth, who'd been working at the foundation for 3 years now. We had a civil, distant relationship built on his consistent accountability. "Did you know she was dying?" I asked. "Yes, I visited her last week. She's different now, Rachel. Broken. Actually human for maybe the first time in her life." "Should I visit?" Kenneth was quiet for a long moment. "Only if it helps you, not for her." I decided quickly. I wouldn't visit because Patricia didn't get closure at my expense, didn't get to use her deathbed to extract absolution I wasn't required to give. But I called the hospice and told them to send all bills for her care to me. "Make sure she's comfortable. Pain medication, whatever she needs. She doesn't need to know who's paying." "That's very generous," the social worker said. "It's not generous," I replied. "It's human." Patricia died 2 weeks later. I didn't attend the funeral, but I sent flowers with a card that said simply, "You can rest now." Kenneth called after the service, his voice thick. "The flowers were beautiful. Thank you." I didn't do it for her, I said. I did it so I could look Sophie in the eye and tell her that even people who hurt us deserve basic human dignity at the end, because that's how cycles break. I gave Patricia something she never gave me: compassion without conditions. Not because she earned it, but because becoming like her would have meant she'd won. And I'd already won by becoming everything she wasn't. 10 years after Dorothy's death, I stood before 500 people at the dedication ceremony for the Marcus and Dorothy Hayes Center for Second Chances. The building rose behind me, all glass and light, $100 million transformed into hope. 200 residential beds, a full therapy center, classrooms, art studios, a gym where kids could be kids without performing gratitude. I was 37 now, silver threading through my hair at the temples in a way that reminded me of Dorothy. Behind me on the stage sat Melissa, who'd become the foundation's executive director, Walter, still serving as board chair despite his retirement from private practice, Kenneth running our boys' mentorship program, and Sophie, 19 now and studying social work, our official youth ambassador. I took the microphone and looked out at the crowd, donors who'd believed in this vision, journalists documenting this moment, city officials who'd helped navigate permits and zoning, and over 100 kids from our programs who'd come to see what they'd helped build just by surviving. 10 years ago, I began, my voice steady. I stood at a wedding and heard the words "adopted girl" used like a curse. Someone wanted me to feel small, unwanted, worthless. I paused, let the silence hold. Today, I stand here and say yes. I'm an adopted girl, and adopted kids are chosen. We're wanted. We're worthy. The applause started small and built like a wave, and I saw some of the kids in the front row sitting up straighter, saw something shift in their faces. This center exists because my grandmother Dorothy Hayes taught me that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's creation. We're not here to punish the people who hurt us. We're here to make sure no other child has to beg for the love they deserve. I shared the numbers we'd prepared: 1,847 children served over 10 years, 94% going on to stable lives, education, careers. That's 1,847 lives that matter. That's 1,847 kids who know they're not charity cases. They're champions. After the ceremony, after the photographs and handshakes and promises to stay in touch, I returned to Dorothy's estate. I still lived here, had converted part of it into the foundation's administrative headquarters, while keeping the private spaces sacred. In my study, I remembered the safe I hadn't opened in years. Inside were Dorothy's original will documents, the DNA test from 2003, and a small envelope I'd been instructed to open on the 10th anniversary. I'd forgotten about it until this moment. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Dorothy's handwriting, weakened by illness, but unmistakably hers, filled 3 pages. She wrote about Marcus, about watching me endure cruelty without becoming cruel, about choosing to heal instead of harm. The $8 billion was never the real inheritance, she wrote. You are. You are the proof that love is stronger than hate, that kindness is stronger than cruelty, that one person choosing to break a cycle can save thousands. The letter ended. The money was just the tool. You were always the weapon. I sat with those words as tears streamed down my face. Through the window, I could see Kenneth playing soccer with 3 boys from the program, actually laughing. Sophie sat on the porch, sketching, probably designing something for her college portfolio. Melissa paced the garden on her phone, coordinating another rescue. This community of healers, this army built on Dorothy's foundation, and my determination was the real legacy. I walked to the window and placed my hand on the glass. I did it, Grandma, I whispered. I became what they said I'd never be. They tried to make me small. Grandma Dorothy taught me to grow, and now I'm teaching others to bloom. That's the best revenge, not destruction but creation. Not tearing down their legacy, but building one so bright it makes theirs disappear into shadow. I won, not by destroying them, but by becoming everything they said I could never be, and then using that power to make sure no child ever feels as small as they made me feel. That's justice. That's love. That's legacy. And somewhere I know Grandma Dorothy is smiling, because the little girl who was told to find another table didn't just find one. She built a table big enough for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. And we're all sitting there now, together, finally home. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to share, and I know it wasn't always easy to hear. But I told it because somewhere out there, someone needs to know they're not alone. If you grew up feeling like you had to earn love, like you were never quite enough, like gratitude was a debt you could never repay, I see you. You matter. Your pain was real, and you deserved better. The Dorothy Hayes Foundation is still growing, still fighting for kids who need someone to believe in them. If this story touched you, if you believe every child deserves to be seen and valued, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel. We share updates about the Foundation's work stories from other survivors and resources for anyone navigating complex family trauma. Your subscription helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Have you experienced something similar? What part of this story resonated most with you? What would you have done differently? Your perspective matters, and this community thrives when we share our truths with each other. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say, "Me too," and let someone else know they're not alone. Remember, you don't have to be perfect to be worthy. You don't have to be grateful for basic human decency. And you are never ever too broken to build something beautiful. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being part of breaking these cycles one story at a time.